if I were talking with an up-and-coming Democrat and I said, hey, you need to be patriotic and tough on the border, very, very humanitarian and economically minded with people who are currently here, and then you need to create a cold, heartless, dynamic um, immigration policy for future people's arrivals. What do I mean by cold-hearted? To even try to bring up this total weird dicta from the 19th century, which they have no instances that it ever controlled any.
It was the
legal
minority
decision
perspective.
ever.
Yeah, it was the minority perspective for sure.
Not just the minority. We're talking about, it was like a weird minority perspective of European commentators. But at the time of conception, she was still inside of, like, what does this attach to?
Yeah, when is it? Conception or birth?
Like,
yeah.
Is it conception or birth? Is it 5 minutes after birth? Is it like what? I mean, just you have to draw arbitrary, intellectually corrupt lines to make the rule work. Unless, of course, the rule is actually at the pleasure of Trump. And if that's what the real rule is, then there's no rule of law. We have abandoned the concept that individuals have inherent dignity and worth. And instead we've said worth is dispensed by our betters. It's the least American thing I could ever think of. It is way worse.
Nate, so good to see you. Oh my God, it's been like, I think years. How are you?
It has. I'm doing really well. It has been
so
years.
Good to
And
hear
I'll just tell chat, I imposed upon Pisco. He did not reach out to me. I reached out to him and I said, Pisco, I am mad. I have things to say. I need a platform to say it. I'm not a content creator. I rage out on Twitter sometimes. That's not real content, though. And you were gracious enough and kind enough to give me a chance to come out and rant about some things today. And so, chat, if I'm a flop and you never want me back, that's easy to make happen.
Well, thank you so much, Nate. People might not know this, but you were a deep cut of the Twitch politics scene. You've been on some of these lesser known panels of, like, for example, Tiberius D, and behind the scenes giving sort of some advice or some insight here and there. And so even if they haven't necessarily seen you before, your presence has been felt. So why don't you give people some background on who you are, where you're coming from, and basically, are you conservative? That's what they're going to ask. Are you conservative? Are you a Trump guy? Why are you mad? And then we'll get into your presentation that you prepared for us on some immigration issues.
Okay, great. I'm Nate Dallin. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, super active. I'm Mormon. I'm like the most Mormon guy you'll ever meet. Since this matters, and it pisses me off that it matters, my ancestors came to this country hundreds of years ago. Don't know why that's relevant, but to people, that's relevant. My politics are homeless. I'm completely homeless. I dislike what's going on in our country a lot. I do not like the president. The second he came down the golden escalator, I thought, oh, we are in trouble. I've been very vindicated by that. But that worry so many years ago. I do not like the Democratic Party. Don't like what they're about. And so chat will get to decide what my politics are.
But you are a lawyer. You are a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer. Yes. I'm a lawyer. I'm an immigration lawyer. Specifically, I defend people. I try to keep people in the country. So that probably makes me a far leftist communist to some people. But I'm facilitating the invasion, some might say, because I fight for work permits for people who've entered the country illegally. I try to get them legal. I defend them in removal proceedings at the immigration court. I've been eyeball deep on the immigration stuff that's been happening really since I started practicing immigration law in 2014. And so my tenure has been dominated by Trump politics and Trump policy.
Sure, yeah, no, and definitely when it comes to conservatives, what you hear oftentimes is you're public enemy number one. They have this theory that is almost in some cases a little bit more gracious, if you can believe it, of the immigrants themselves versus the quote NGOs and lawyers who are like facilitating it. So before we get into that, how has that been in terms of, because I know among Mormons and among more centristy conservative types, there's mixed views on Trump, but when it comes to specifically immigration attorneys, there's a feeling among a lot of Trump supporters that you guys are like the worst of the worst.
Well, from their perspective, we probably are, right? So my I came to immigration law. Immigration law called to me. I didn't go to it. That's probably the better way to say it. So I served a Spanish speaking mission for 2 years. So I turned 19 years old. I put in my papers to do a Mormon mission. I was called to serve in the Ecuador Guayaquil North mission. I served there from 2005 to 2007 as a 19-year-old punk. And so I lived for 2 years. I had a 9 month stretch where I was the only white guy that I saw or spoke with or lived with. I learned Spanish. I spoke Spanish. I continued to speak Spanish. And I totally, so many crazy things happened that in Ecuador that caused me to really question and think about life and the meaning of life and how people can lead good lives in different kind of economic circumstances, how politics helps and hurts people, what makes it an effective country. Like, how come Ecuador has an endemic poverty problem and the United States doesn't? Like, what all those types of things were just shoved into my life as a lived experience. I came back from my mission, went to BYU, right? Hyper conservative. My first vote was
Brigham
for
Young
George W. Bush.
University. You go for it.
Yeah, Brigham Young University. I'm not like, sort of infamously racist BYU, right? That's where I went to school. I have voted Republican straight ticket my whole adult life up and until the Trump era. In the Trump era, I bailed on the top of the ticket and then voted straight Republican in 2016, and then again in 2020. When I'm at law school, since I'm from Omaha, I came back. I went to Creighton University School of Law. Third tier trash, I know, Pisco. You don't have to rub it in my face. It's fine. And then I had a great time. I loved law school. Like, law school is awesome. I love everything about law school. I have zero bad things to say. The debt is a little bit of an issue, sure. But like, I loved it. I wish it was affordable, and I wish everyone had to go to the 1L year. You don't have to go to years 2 and 3, but I think every person should have to go through 1L year. I think it's amazing. It helps you grow as a person and as a thinker. And as I was there, I felt called to. I mean, really, I felt called to immigration law, and it was because of a deep love for my country. I want to be specific about this. I saw demographic trends. I saw that our country was entering a period of demographic decline, and that the best way to preserve our culture, our society, our people, our ideals was to get as many motivated people who want to be part of this project as possible into the project.
And to be
And that
clear,
meant
when you
as
say
many immigrants as is humanly possible.
yeah, and just to be clear, when you say demographic decline, it's not a dog whistle. I'm assuming you're talking about the aging demographic
No.
crisis in across the
Yes.
world, and especially in a lot of advanced countries, including the United States.
That's exactly right. This is not some weird white genocide thing. Like, there are more white people today than there's ever on the planet. Like, that's a weird thought.
I'm just
Pisco's
protecting
hit
you
it
from
on the
all the
head.
lefties who are they hear demographics and their mind goes, oh, this person is
Yeah.
Richard Spencer.
Yeah, sorry, chat. Again, my politics are going to be psychotic. I'm not going to fit. I don't know what to tell you, but it's I I have weird relationships with the welfare state. We could talk about that. What social programs make sense, which ones don't. But I can tell you this: Medicare will cost more money next year than it does this year, and it will cost way more money the year after, and so on until
And it will
2035.
not stop costing
How
more
are we
money.
going? Right? Like, and by the way, this is not arithmetic, meaning you can't just say, well, like, more people are entering the system for healthcare costs. It's logarithmic, meaning as people's health deteriorates as they get older, the cost of the people already in the system will become more expensive until their deaths. And how on earth do we expect to be able to fund that unless we have an energetic, hardworking, disciplined class of people willing to work really hard, be very productive in our society, and pay an enormous amount of taxes? And since we made decisions 40 years ago to shrink our population by having fewer children, the only way to support this is to get as many entrepreneurially minded immigrants into the US as possible.
Open
And so
borders.
I felt called to this, and I got into it, and I've loved every second of it. It has been it's been so great for me. So great.
No, that's wonderful to hear. A few questions before we get into the topic parentheses S of the day. The first one has to do with your your interaction with the Twitch panel political scene. Um, you're watching from afar. You're occasionally pinging me about some immigration debates that I'm doing. What, if anything, from the policy perspective? Obviously, we heard you have differences with certain Republicans at the top of the ticket, but from a policy perspective on immigration, what are the Democrats missing? What do you think the discourse is missing? Before we get into some of the legal stuff.
Immigration is not one topic. It's a severable conversation. So let me give you an example. I think people like Matt Iglesias and Ezra Klein and what's that guy on Twitter, Noah Smith or something
No,
like that.
yes,
There's
the econ guy.
the econ guy. So there's a bunch of people who take stock in like the following data from pollsters. It'll be something like, do you want to deport all illegal immigrants? Okay, valid question. And you'll get something like 55% of Americans say yes to that question. Okay. Well, if you ask that same group of people a follow-up question, do you want to deport someone who's committed no crimes and has been in the United States for 20 years and has children? Suddenly, there's only 25% approval for that.
Yeah.
So what does that mean about the first question? Right? I took a good polling class at BYU, so I took a class on nothing but polling. I wrote my own poll. I did an exit poll during an election that was funded by the university. I drove around and picked up stuff. One of the things that you have to be very careful about when reading poll data is this problem of concept drift inside of a sequence of questions. So border security is wildly popular. Wildly popular. When you hear the phrase illegal immigrant,
My
what
mind
comes to the
goes,
mind
yes.
of it goes to the border. That is not the same thing as Jose, who's worked on the same strawberry farm for 20 years. Now, is there a border component to Jose's story? Obviously, there is. But those are two separable policy issues. The border and border security is one set of issues. And I think that Democrats could totally do better about talking about the border specifically. And then another set of issues are, what do we do with everyone who's here and is part of the fabric of this country, love it or not? They're here and they're part of that fabric. What do we do with those folks? There's other questions about what do you do with criminals. So maybe Jose had a 20-year run and he was doing great. Then he had a DUI and caused some property damage. What do you do in that situation? The criminal immigrant issue is totally separate. Okay. And then the fourth category is, how much legal immigration should we have?
Right.
All of those questions, I think, are separable. And inside of the human mind, and as you talk with just normal people and you start to separate those things out, you end up with conclusions that have tension between each other. So I think if I were talking with an up and coming Democrat and I said, hey, you need to be patriotic and tough on the border, very, very humanitarian and economically minded with people who are currently here. And then you need to create a cold, heartless, dynamic um, immigration policy for future people's arrivals. What do I mean by cold hearted? I don't mean be harsh. What I mean is take the politics out. I think it's mostly a math question. Once you've kind of determined what you think a good level of immigration is, which by the way, that'd be a very hard debate and get everybody on the same page would be tough. But once you kind of know what the answer is, you take the politicians out and you make it cold and calculated. And you say, all right, we're going to shoot for X amount of immigration per year. And then we will move that number up and down, not based upon a cap, but on some percentage. So say while unemployment is low, immigration should be high. So the number will automatically cold, won't ask about a politician or a poll. It'll say, hey, if unemployment is low, immigration should be high. And if unemployment is high, immigration should be low. Something like that. Take the human bias out of it and allow the system to dynamically adapt to what the needs of the country are. And don't make it a political issue every single time we have a wave of immigrants or a wave of unemployment, and take the demons inside of people's heads out of the equation. That's what I would recommend.
What an excellent answer. And there's so many layers to what you just said there. um, including the fact that a lot of those conversations, which I think are separable and are different in nature in terms of how people react to them and in terms of what the answer is, that those are layered on a pre-existing system that we currently have to operate with, a system that
Right.
is archaic, that is contradictory at times. I mean, you bring up this example of Jose who gets a DUI or something, and the need to have like a mathematical cold approach. I knew instantly what you meant because in the situation that you provided, there's not a clear answer, right? The code
Yeah.
defines a CIMT, right? The crime involving moral turpitude, but there's no like known solution or known answer for a lot of these problems in terms of like whether you'll be allowed to say that. Like what I think the trends or one of the aspects that defines immigration law is uncertainty and waiting around. And so it is a bunch of complicated and difficult policy questions, perhaps, to set up. Um, but the current system, as it is a system that's defined, I think, partly by uncertainty, by agony, and by lack of clarity. Thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, so it's important to recognize that the history of immigration law in the United States is not uniform, meaning it's a Frankenstein system that borrows on old British common law concepts, which we'll talk about some today, I think. It also borrows on um, odd moments in time. So, like certain, like the or the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s. That's like a very specific contextual thing for that moment. But some of the stuff that was passed then has remained in the law.
Mm-hmm.
The law has contradictory values. The law has inconsistent and tension between itself as to who should be allowed in and who shouldn't be allowed in and why. The law is also extremely vague. And by the way, when I mean vague, I mean that in a technical lawyer sense. There are terms which do not have a normal, reasonable use. You just used one. Crime involving moral turpitude. Even for lawyers, that just
Or
smacks of
Mormons,
make
or
crap
Mormons.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it is, it's really easy for people to take their biases when the law is vague and meanings are a little bit amorphous. You can take your own biases and your own political motives of the moment and project them into terms. And then you can pull off some really fun lawyering in the most nefarious way possible, where you will try to have concept drift and change the outcomes of the law over time without ever changing the words of the law. And it's not sort of a common law progression, it's more nefarious. It's a statutory interpretation that changes depending on the whims of the political moment. And so I do believe the Immigration and Nationality Act is a disaster, mostly because of this vagary
Yes. No.
and this lack of coherence. And
And
so the amount of overhaul is like legion. We could do a ton of stuff to overhaul.
100%. And just so people understand what he was saying there, this distinction between common law and statutory law, you might think that vagueness and general capacious language is more appropriate for a constitutional sort of system, judge-made law that's interpreting some general principle or whatever. And what he's describing is that it's not like that. That these statutory codes, oftentimes interpreted in a binding way by executive officers in the current setup, it stinks not of like this like um unified march down a particular common law like evolutionary pathway, but instead the fits and starts different, almost like a schizophrenic style political
Yes.
inquiry of the day, right? And you add
Yeah.
layers to that of Bill Clinton adjusting it a little bit here and there, George Bush adjusting it here and there after 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that we'll talk about today, and what I think is, if anything, like a core concept that undergirds a lot of what we're talking about, is this notion of citizenship, which I kind of ground down to a values question of who is part of the club. And the Constitution doesn't even define citizenship. What does it mean to be a U.S. citizen? And so we need to take a big step back here and realize that in order to even understand a lot of the concepts that we're talking about, it's a question of values for sure, but it's definitely a question of history, and one that needs a lot of context to fully grasp. So why don't you give me a response to that and introduce our first issue of the day.
Yeah. So one of the things that's so fun about law school is trying to come to understand how the rules of society operate. Sometimes that's statutory law, sometimes that's constitutional law, sometimes that's administrative law or admin law, sometimes it's custom, sometimes it's history and tradition. There's a lot of different ways in which the rules of society evolve over time. And navigating those rules in real time with real people is sort of the mission of the lawyer, right? I don't know if that's the best way to describe that, but that's sort of its mission. Citizenship is fascinating, and it's the thing that's got me all fired up. And I'll say this too, Pisco, and I now look at the world in the framework of people who defend Enlightenment values and people who don't. Sometimes that's coded as classical liberalism.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's actually proper to say the Enlightenment is a liberal project. Maybe it is. If so, great. Like, I don't know.
Did you see Katie Miller
I
about
can tell you
classical liberalism, where she confused liberal values for politically liberal in the American sense? No, but that is the usual phrase is classic liberalism. Yeah.
Yeah, classic liberalism. Again, our language is so poor on this. I prefer to say the Enlightenment because it gets rid of Enlightenment values, jettisons any sort of political coding. It's the only reason why I like to say it this way. So when I think of the Enlightenment, I specifically think of the English-speaking Enlightenment. This is guys like Locke, Adam Smith, Hume, right? These are political philosophers and economists, political economics, right? These guys come up with a basket of ideas that I think are amazing for humans. I think they're so good. They're
And they're
I don't even know.
correlated
To me,
with
that
the
is what.
advent of coffee, which is wild to me that as a Mormon, I'm
Yeah,
guessing you don't partake in caffeine or coffee, but you can thank these wonderful Enlightenment values. I mean, listen, switching over to a stimulant must have had some effect, but no, yes, really great ideas that inspired a lot of people, including the founders of this country.
yeah, and okay. And so this is a little bit of a historic claim that I'm about to make, right? And so this my claim in history is this: the greatest insight, I guess the two greatest insights of the Enlightenment were number one, reality is best understood through observations and evidence. Okay. Why? What was the position before? It was
Revelation.
dogma, tradition, and scholasticism,
Yeah.
right? So like, which by the way is no good. This is no good because if there's anything that didn't align with reality, observable reality didn't align with a dogma or a tradition inside of the scholastic system, it was immediately attacked and people were beheaded and burned at the stake for it. So like that's not good, right? So being honest about reality was punished in the old system. That's bad. So that's probably the great first insight of the Enlightenment. Observation and evidence over tradition and feelings. Okay? Tradition and feelings, by the way, a lot of times are rooted in reality. That's not like a total repudiation of tradition, but it says that tradition doesn't have a good self-correcting mechanism when an insight about truth and reality occurs.
A
So
modern
that's the first
incarnation
one.
of this is facts and logic. And on that second point
Oh,
that you just had there about tradition history sometimes being girded to facts and logic, I don't even necessarily deny that at all. I had a conversation with
yeah,
Counterpoints where he was charting out certain religious dogmas in terms of like a plausibly rational basis. They didn't want to eat seafood because it did this or that, or it was this a
sure.
prohibition against this because of the animals that were there. And I don't think that everything's explained by that, but I'm not. There is, I think, a bias. There ought to be a bias against like uprooting a system that has been developed over time, and even the law itself is built on tradition. But there needs to be a self-check mechanism. Crucially, that is what these values will provide. And democracy itself, to a certain extent, can be thought of as like a safety valve for some of these
That's
I don't
right.
know, corrections.
That's right. So the second great insight is that the consent of the governed
There
is
we
the
go.
best political system. That often means democracy. It doesn't have to, by the way. I think that communism is a child of the Enlightenment. And right, and so you could come up with another system of governance that is still rooted in the Enlightenment and its values, and that system could still reap all the most of the benefits. I mean, we could quibble about that, but and not necessarily be a democracy, but still have a consent of the governed type of foundation. Okay, You can do it a lot of different ways, actually, but nonetheless, democracy I
And that
think is
is
the
a
best.
change. I mean, that is a change in the English sense. Not that it's necessarily incompatible with the English law as it was. The law emanated from the king, and the king, of course, had his right to rule from God. And this is, I think, and you tell me if you disagree, is flipping sort of the nature, the relationship between the people and the state as like wards of the state versus we're the one in whom sovereignty, to the extent that it exists, is grounded and based. We're not just merely necessarily born subjects, but the legitimacy of the rulers comes from below, not necessarily from above, or not in such an explicit way.
It's probably cynical, and it'll be surprising to hear from a religious person such as myself, but the divine right of kings, I think, was just a huge amount of rhetorical cope. The divine right of kings was really just the right of violence and coercion. And so if my great grandfather, assume for a moment I'm a sovereign from lineage, from bloodline. So my great granddad was the most violent person, became a warlord, and crowned himself king. That is how many of the European polities began, right? Then his son, my grandfather, didn't have to do as much violence on people because we already had a stable system. And hopefully he did some good things and was a great king, whatever. Then my father is now also removed from the legitimacy of the violence of the system. And now here I am. Now I've got to justify my rule, which was based upon the violence of 3 generations behind me. And so I come up with this big cope, which is like, oh, God has called me. Therefore, you should be obedient to me. And that was a much softer way of saying, I have the secret police. I will kill you if you do not listen to me. Right.
No, no,
That's,
yeah, I think that a lot of this is post hoc. I think a lot of this is created after the fact.
yeah.
It's so interesting. I was going. There was a more commie pilled person on Twitter who was responding to this liberal account saying, "Listen, slavery is an invention of liberal society or something, at least in America." I'm like, no, no. Listen. Slavery predates the American Revolution. Slavery doesn't owe its existence to liberalism. There are, I'm sure, people who used liberalism and notions of property to justify after the fact. Just like, by the way, people use religion and get inspiration from religion in the context of freeing the slaves. Doesn't necessarily mean that slavery, the abolishment of slavery, is ideologically rooted in biblical tradition, even if a lot of the most foremost abolitionists were. I want to push back a little bit. Doesn't mean I'm disagreeing right now, because I actually agree with you. But let me say that you're guilty, before we get into the actual legal analysis, you're guilty of the exact thing that you're accusing the divine right of kings of being. You went to Ecuador.
Yep.
Your heart ached for these people. You look around your country, your heart aches for a lot of these people. You feel this almost biological, or you're a Mormon. You feel compelled to make people's lives better. And so you've crafted this whole theory and explanation and liberal values and whatever because it fits what your heart tells you, what your emotion wants you to do, because you're a bleeding heart. And so all this thing
Oh, yeah.
about a liberal heart, liberal stuff, this is all post hoc. You're inventing this structure to justify your bleeding heart. Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't see that as a post hoc thing at all. I'm on team the psychology of all humans. All of us are lawyers. It's just how good a lawyer are we? So we start off with an intuition. We start off with a feeling. That feeling then starts to drive our behavior, and then we use our powers of reason to post hoc justify
Mm.
the thing that we were doing that was just based off of feelings in the
So
first
you
place.
bite the bullet and you
And
say yes, and everything is like that.
yes, and everything is like that. And by the way, the enlightenment value that helps us to disentangle human psychosis and our feelings, which aren't always related to reality, right? The feelings that are appropriately related to reality are perfectly fine. So if I have a delicious piece of pizza and it is objectively a delicious piece of pizza, and that drives me to again go partake of delicious pizza, no one would say that my feelings are a problem. Feelings are a problem when they no longer are operative in the real world. They're detached from
They don't cohere
sensory
with.
perceptions inside the real
Right,
world.
right.
So, how can we check ourselves? Because all of us have irrational feelings. All of us do.
Yeah.
So, how do we check ourselves? Well, we might use other humans in like a peer review way or in a polity, in sort of a political system where we can give each other checks and balances and we can have little feedbacks. And you, Pisco, can tell me, Nate, that's stupid. And I can sit back and say, okay, wait. Maybe Pisco's right. Maybe I
I
am
don't think it's
stupid.
stupid. I think it's scary for some people because I think that it leads us to the following conclusion. And this is something that a lot of these presuppositional thinkers, who I don't think are taken very seriously in religious circles, but they prey on a kind of fear, which is, who's to say, Nate, that
Right.
your feeling is, quote unquote, whatever this will mean, more valid or more objectively true than my feeling? In which case, right? This and this is what I found in these birthright citizenship conversations that we're going to have. It almost doesn't matter whether you convince them or not, because if they don't have the
No.
value
Yeah.
of following the Constitution, and if their value is keep them out, then we can say all the things we want to say in the world about the origins of the English common law. We have the value of adhere to the law. We have the value of help people when it's possible, when it makes sense, and they have another predominating value. And we, at Bedrock, have to say, well, that's your value, and we can't disprove it.
Yeah. Yeah. So this gets us into it. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Can chat see my
Yes.
doublet
Yes. So
slideshow?
they can.
Okay.
You just need to let me know when you want to
All
switch
right.
slides over, and yeah. So this is our conversation is going to start about birthright citizenship. I think that it is so foundational to all these questions that we're talking about, because ultimately, it's a question of who's part of the club, who gets access to the thing that we, the rights and privileges as full members of our society, whatever that means. And we know a lot of the initial conflicts in our country are a result of disagreements of citizenship, to say nothing of slavery and the foreign influence, this kind of thing. And so it's so great to have you, and thank you for that little introduction. So let's get into it, and I'll let you take the lead.
Okay. So my contention. This is my argument. Birthright citizenship is a foundational pillar of the American social contract. So Pisco's already said this. Who is in our little experiment of governance in the United States? That's the question. And not only who is in it, but how are we going to allow people into it into the future? My second contention is, in America, individuals are free and equal in virtue of their humanity and not their parentage. Okay. Now, where do I get these ideas? They're rooted in history and tradition. They're also just rooted, I think, in good, straightforward thinking. So we don't have to. I mean, look, I'm a nerd, so we can nerd out on some of this stuff
Yeah.
if we want to, or we can just quickly go over it. But my my way of thinking about this is in three buckets. The first is some of this Enlightenment language. What did David Hume and John Locke say about being part of a social group, a polity, a group of people that live together? It's actually quite miraculous, I think, that non-kin, I have no blood relation to probably anyone listening to this stream, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet we can like work together.
Yeah.
That does not happen in nature almost at all, right? And so here we are doing this thing, and Locke and Hume give us some good observations and good ideas about how to make that work.
It's like
The second
it's like
bucket then
an
is,
API, or like interoperability. Like you have a software installed, and you're able to interface with other people who have the software installed or who have the API, and these are some of the components of
yeah,
it. So Locke and Hume, tell us.
that's right. And so by the way, just the advantages to us as people are enormous. The fact that I can interact with and have a friendship with you makes my life fuller and better in every way, emotionally, physically, and in engineering, economic opportunity. This ability to have a positive, free exchange of ideas without violence and coercion constantly being on our backs is so good for human flourishing. I just can't. That is like such a big deal. Okay. And the second bucket then is, what's the history of birthright citizenship? So inside of our American context, where did we start? How did it start? How did we get to where we are now? And then the third thing is, what's going to happen on April 1st, which
Yeah.
is oral arguments at the U.S. Supreme
Oof.
Court on the birthright citizenship executive order by President Trump on January 20th, 2025. And so that's kind of the framework for this whole thing. And I got a lot of slides, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm
No.
just a
No.
nerd.
No worries. I think that this is beautiful. I would add one aspect to this, which is the primacy in my mind in the American tradition here of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, who in a way kind of used the Jeffersonian idea of all men are created equal, this, from the Declaration of Independence, and kind of changed its meaning a bit, and adapted it for the times, to include a broader set of individuals. And obviously, in Gettysburg, pronounced a new birth of freedom. And I think that uh, both in embracing a lot of these ideals and in Lincoln being part of our collective memories, and it's almost patron saint of America, in some ways even more saintly than George Washington, perhaps because of the nature of how he died. I think also looms large over this conversation. But I can go on the next slide if you'd like.
Yeah. So go ahead. So the first foray here on slide number 2 is this idea that so like the package of ideas inside the Enlightenment that I think are great and we should be slow to abandon are reason and observation as opposed to tradition and dogma, natural rights, things like life, liberty, and property, versus feudal favors. So remember, in the pre-Enlightenment era, freedom was a gift from a feudal lord in every society. This is not about just the West. This is just true. Go back to the cradle of civilization in Egypt. And if you had personal freedom, that was a gift bestowed upon you by Pharaoh, right? And all societies follow this. This is just a human reality. Government by consent versus violence, coercion, divine right, tradition, or bloodlines. This idea that um, that people should be assenting and consenting to their political life versus being forced into political life through these other means. Equality before the law, meaning hereditary. It's a repudiation of heredity as justification for different treatment of behavior. So who your dad was means you play by a different set of rules. That it's a total the Enlightenment is a repudiation of this. This is a terrible idea.
Which is, yeah,
It's actually not good for the people who play by the preferred set of rules,
yes.
and it's certainly not good for the people on the bottom of that
Which is so
situation.
funny because in the American context, even though these titles of nobility are like almost they're officially banned, in at least in the conception of the Constitution as we understand it today, but the revolution itself was at least pushed for, and the major figures were members of this like very elite class, of aristocrats, to say nothing of the political dynasties that we have had after the fact that are in some case premised on this notion of the completion of think of, for example, the Kennedy dynasty, or Hillary
Yeah.
Clinton picking up the mantle, or George Bush, the father and the son. Even though I think a lot of American memory and history belongs to some of these political families that are better off, officially it is a repudiation of this equality, different statuses. Obviously that wasn't the reality, or the lived reality, for a lot of people at the start of the founding, but that certainly was a philosophical component of it.
That's right. And I'll say all of these values have not been fully achieved. None of these values have been fully lived and experienced on equal footing across all peoples in the West. But I think that the values themselves are noble and good and worth defending. And the notion that we would get better results as a country, as a people, by going back to the alternative to these values, I think is where that's just wrongheaded. I don't think that the Enlightenment is perfect. I think that it does have some problems. It's bad for community. I would say this is the number one thing: is the emphasis on personal observation and personal autonomy and personal sovereignty has made community formation more difficult over time. Now, we could talk about why that is and things like that. But when I talk about community formation, I'm talking about like bowling alone, right? This idea that Americans in particular, Europeans also, are less likely to go to church. They're less likely to hang out in person and go bowling together. We have fewer baseball teams. Kids aren't playing with each other in the streets like they used to. I do think that there's tension with some of the individualistic and sovereign ideas of the individual that makes it more difficult for automatic community formation. Again, that is not to say that the alternative is better,
Yeah.
that somehow community under the force of the iron boot of the state as a defense mechanism is somehow superior to the alternative, right? So
And
imagine for a moment Yeah, just imagine for a moment if you're in a concentration camp, if you're in Auschwitz, you will build a very strong community with the other people suffering with you. And that community will be special and beautiful and amazing because the circumstances are so awful that in order to get any sort of human flourishing, you will create a very special kind of community. Similarly, people who've served in the military, they have a bond because their lives have been on the line in a way, and that creates a really deep community. I don't think we should all be putting ourselves in harm's way to build these communities,
Yeah,
right?
no,
Like,
no,
there's
that makes a ton of sense, and so there's a just because it's lacking in one area doesn't mean it's preferable overall. Another context in
that's right.
which I think these kinds of systems rear their heads in is oddly enough in diplomacy, where having these kinds of lineal relationships. Think about Game of Thrones. Think about
Yeah,
the house, the Saudi family, royal family, and stuff. They're able to come to deals and agreements that, in some senses, have the potential to last longer over a course of time. If Trump has a full hand and there's a lineage of Trumpian like people that come after, like there is in some of these other countries, they're going to be able to come to certain kinds of agreements, certain sorts of arrangements that perhaps a democratic country where the president can change in 4 years just based on the whims of the people, maybe that narrows the path of what you can do. Similar things with like bribes. If you're not allowed to bribe someone like Trump, what kinds of things can you do to grease the wheels? But that doesn't mean that the international system operates better under feudalage
yeah,
or feudalism or with kings. I mean, look at all the wars that existed in the context of that system. And so just because certain aspects aren't fully addressed in the Enlightenment values, or indeed any other system, doesn't mean the system overall isn't preferable. So that point is well taken. I know you're not advocating for Auschwitz for everybody or for everyone to be drafted in the military.
obviously.
Yeah.
No, that's right. But you can kind of see the point, right? Like there's no such thing as a free ticket. Like there's no free lunch ticket. So every set of values will eventually come into tension with other sets of values. It's it's just like a part of reality. It's part of the human predicament. It is impossible for us to get the perfect golden ticket arrangement of things to create a utopia. And I'm saying this as a Mormon. Like Joseph Smith was like completely committed to trying to create a utopian universe, right? But it's lived experience makes that extremely
By the way, have you seen the
difficult.
Book of Mormon? It's a great show.
The musical, of course.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like every Mormon has it. There's a point that Sam Harris once made, and I sometimes I think Sam Harris can be a bit cringe, but I like some of the stuff that he does. He said something like, Mormons, when the Book of Mormon came out, unlike some other religions or some other radicals, they took out ads in the Book of Mormon and the playbill and stuff. And so, for whatever reason, it seems like the Mormon community has not like taken issue with the Book of Mormon. But no, I just wanted to ask that question real quick. Sorry, continue on.
Yeah.
You're
No,
on number
absolutely.
5.
Okay, number 5, and then science, commerce, and education. This is just this idea that science, commerce, and education are high value and high value add to humanity, and that so things that will help science, commerce, and education progress are of a higher value than things that will stop those things. So this is where you get things like tariffs bad. Well, why are tariffs bad? It's because it limits commerce. Education should be more universal. Science has a set of values that are worthy and things that we should be going towards, versus things like peonage, slavery, vassal states, ignorance as virtue. And so those are sort of the alternative systems of thought. Obviously, I phrase these things very negatively. I could have probably done so in a more charitable way to try to show like the scholastic or the more traditional view of the world and how that stands in opposition in a more favorable light. But I really do
You're
just
arguing from your
look at the
worldview. This is a polemic as well as
yeah,
instructional.
yeah, and I just again want to say life was not better for anyone prior to say 1600. It just wasn't. And one of the things that just, and this is, I mentioned this before, Pisco. I like to see the world in this view now, where if I see a right wing commentator or content creator propose an idea, I ask myself, are they repudiating the Enlightenment or are they embracing the Enlightenment with this particular proposal or idea? And increasingly, I have found that right wing commentators are actually just against the five values I've just described. They would come up with a different vocabulary to describe their critique, but they're out on this and they actually do believe that it's time to revert back to a more fiefdom, feudal, race-based, bloodline-based universe. And I just can't imagine how you come to that conclusion.
You know,
I
I,
just can't imagine
I,
that.
I think for each one of the ones that you've given, I can definitely give examples for each one. I'll do one for each, and then we'll get into how birthright citizenship fits into this. So for number one, I feel like tradition dogma, the less said, the better. I mean, so many aspects of the dogmatic view of MAGAism, including the notion of America First itself as a dogma. And number two, on natural rights, yeah, like all of these. Trump has proposed collectivizing certain industries. Trump has proposed, I mean, obviously, a lot of his policies are infringing on what would be considered liberties, that at least in the American context. Number three, yeah, bloodlines and tradition. They want to make Baron Trump a thing. They are obsessed with this notion of the Trump family and the dynasty itself, equality before the law. They specifically want there to be no equality before the law. They want there to be a hierarchy of rights according to hereditary considerations. And then, yeah, I think that at times they value ignorance, or at least they do not value the people who are most. They don't trust the experts, etc. It's a rejection of that. So yeah, I think that that's part of our moment as well. Not to say the left doesn't have problems with this as well, but tell us how citizenship fits in there.
Okay, so John Locke, this is probably the great phrase from his second treatise on government. It says, quote, "Men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living, one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties and a greater security against any that are not of it." All right, kind of old-timey English. Basic thrust is we're all born free. We are born into a state of freedom, equality, and independence. And that we then consent into an arrangement whereby we can make each other's lives better. That's the basis of all good functioning society. That is good culture. And I think that the birthright citizenship is a reflection of that value. Okay. So he did not use the phrase birthright citizenship, but in a state of nature, the most natural thing for a human is to leave that person's mother's womb and enter the world as a
Free.
free,
Yeah.
independent, and all babies are equal.
Yeah, no,
Right? Like,
we will get into that for sure, because this is part of the debate I had with Ryan Mullally about whom the birthright citizenship clause and these rules apply to, that it does apply to babies. And when we think about that it applies to babies, it flips a lot of intuitions in people's head. And even Nick, who asked the first question in that debate, this is the husband of not so erudite Kyla, he, the first thing he said was like, yeah, it seems like in America we have this notion that we don't blame children for the sins of their father. And yeah, exactly. And so in birth, again, is like a concept that's linked a lot of these places. I just mentioned Lincoln said a new birth of freedom. And yeah, so there's a concept of renewal or birth that I don't know what it is, but there's something there. I think you've got a hand on it. Let me give a little pushback before you go to the next slide, because I will be remiss if we just are glazing each other and doing a kind of circle jerk type stuff.
yeah, I'm not here to circle jerk.
Yeah, this says consent. This says consent. And the right-wing people, and certainly even some of the briefing of the case that we're talking about here. Oh my God, Barbara, the Barbara case that the SCOTUS is actually considering. Consent is a part of it. The consent is at a level of generality perhaps removed from yours, which is the consent of the people of America. And did you ask them for consent to apply birthright citizenship to these people? And so why should the American people, without their consent, be giving to all these hordes or all these different people whose parents came here illegally?
Hordes.
Yeah.
The hordes.
The prize, the benefit of birthright citizenship, even though the American people don't want it. We have a response to that, but real quick for you before we get into it, any thoughts?
Yeah, so this is it's a sleight of hand on the
Yeah.
rhetoric. The sleight of hand is that remember John Locke is talking about own consent,
Yep.
individualized levels of consent versus abstract levels or abstract group consent. Again, hilarious. I probably shouldn't use names, but Chris Rufo, okay, so
He's a
Chris
clown.
Rufo, who has made a career off of attacking group level thinking, DEI, I'm using the scare quotes, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, group level thinking. He thinks that group level identity is bad. And now he's all in on group level identity. Okay, so it's one of these things where somebody like Chris Rufo would tell you that a group level identity and consent is required to allow the horde to enter into the polity.
Mhm.
And my response to that is, you crazy. Who is the spokesperson for the aggregate level of the group? I am one of these members of the group. As I said sort of at the outset, it shouldn't have to matter, but I'm as heritage American as you're going to find. I've got Mayflower connections. My most recent immigrant ancestor was 1855, right? Like that is the most recent of my ancestors who immigrated to the United States. So I am a member of this polity. I consent to the hordes, guys. So
Yeah,
now what are you going to
yeah.
do? Like,
No,
I just don't understand how it even makes sense. Like, you have to create a monolith of my community, me and my community of the heritage, right? So you create a monolith, and now you've created the monolith and said at the group level, I have to consent. Okay, Chris, that's not how like freedom works. That is an anti-freedom, anti-enlightenment notion.
yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said there, and especially because they don't ever provide like an empirical basis for their bare assertion that the group does not consent, by which we would, I assume, mean like some kind of like representative say. But then another thing have problem with is it's question begging. This whole inquiry is trying to
Yeah.
decide who is a part of the community, who is a part of the club, and so you can't say, well, you don't have the permission of the club, because the whole point of this is to establish who, as an initial matter, is part of the club, such that they would even have a say in the first place. And so I
Right.
have an issue with that because, like, uh, we cannot refer to notions of consent that would presuppose that the people are outside of the club when we're trying to find whether they are or not in the first instance. So that's kind of what I'm saying is
That's
like
right.
any kind of notion of consent that's premised on inclusion or non-inclusion into the club is self-defeating because we need to figure that out first before we can start,
That's right.
taking the denominator. Go ahead. Sorry.
And so the traditionalists, these people like Chris Rufo, are going to make an arbitrary line in the sand. I think you spoke with Joel Webbin, which, by the way,
That was wild. Yeah.
did you? Yeah, did you take like 20 showers after that? Like that guy, holy Toledo.
I didn't really even know. He seems like a Matt Walshy type, precept type guy. And I got some. Listen, I shake hands with these people behind the scenes. I'm able to get
Yeah,
along with them behind the scenes, but
no, of course.
it is quite it is quite sick, some of the things that they said. And even there, I think the most viral thing I've ever put out there is when he was talking about shooters, and like the notion that trans people are biologically engineered to kill white Christians. And I'm like, well, don't
Yeah,
you think that there's ever been like a white Christian nationalist shooter? And he's like, I'm not sure about that. And it's like, and he defines, and it's kind of the same thing that we're talking about Chris Rufo here. He defines white Christian nationalists to be whatever the good people are, and whoever's bad obviously can't be a white Christian nationalist. But sorry, yeah, yes. So
right.
yes, I did have a shower afterwards, but no, he was nice behind the
By the
scenes,
way,
but he had some odious ideas.
no, obviously. So, by the way, this is a slight rabbit hole tangent. I actually think that he is still an American. I think we need to be able to engage people with like I'm not a huge deep platformer type.
Yeah, me neither.
But I mean, Joel really does have some like very pernicious and arbitrary beliefs.
Yes.
And that's kind of my point. What John Locke is proposing, I think, is a better worldview that does a better job at it engaging with all of reality and not having to draw artificial carve-outs constantly to make your worldview work, right? And so that's why the Enlightenment's good, is because we have fewer rules for the worldview, and then it helps just unfold all of reality for us. Whereas if you're a guy like Joel or Chris Rufo, you're gonna have to draw a ton of arbitrary lines. Self-defeating ideas require arbitrary lines to be drawn and say, well, this isn't. Why? Because I said so. It's the only way to make my idea work. And I think it's self-defeating. It's
Yep.
no good. All right, next slide. So for those who are frustrated by this idea that the social contract is clearly an abstraction, it's a myth. It doesn't actually cohere to reality. David Hume actually critiqued that very idea from an Enlightenment perspective, and he says, when we consider how nearly equal all men are in their bodily force, and even in their mental powers and faculties, I'm just reading the highlighted part here, that nothing but their own consent could at first associate them together and subject them to any authority. But we trace it plainly to the nature of man, and in the equality or something approaching equality, which we find in all individuals of that species. The force which now prevails, and which is founded on fleets and armies, is plainly political and derived from authority, the effect of established government. Jumping ahead, but when he thinks, as all mankind do who are born under established governments, that by his birth he owes allegiance to a certain prince or certain form of government, it would be absurd to infer a consent or choice which he expressly in this case renounces and disclaims. Can we seriously say that a poor peasant or artisan who has a free choice to leave his country, when he knows no foreign language or manners, and lives from day to day by the small wages which he acquires? Okay, so David Hume says we recognize that the social contract is an abstraction, it's a myth, it's not actually history. That's not how governments were formed. We're born into a situation of established government and coercion and force. But at the same time, can we really say that a person born into one of these circumstances has the ability to just abandon ship? He says no, obviously not. This is important as we talk about the implications of revoking birthright citizenship and what it might mean for millions of people in the
Practically,
future.
yes.
Yeah, just as a logistics point, I think that it's important to understand we're about to create an enormous problem. But we'll
Can we
talk about
pause
that in
right
a
there
minute.
because there was a
But
really
Hume
beautiful
goes on to
exchange.
say,
Sorry, I just want to pause real quick because I think what you said there and what this quote is saying is so important. There was a beautiful exchange in the Casa decision between Kavanaugh and I think the SG, where he was like, "What does this look like? I mean, are you going to go to the hospitals and start like checking whether or not they enter without inspection or whether they're here, in violation of a law or they have a visa? Like, what the hell does this start to look like? We start not sending social security cards, and so." Very much throughout this conversation on citizenship and revoking it, putting aside whether or not it should be revoked, is how it's going to be done and what are the practical logistic implications of changing rules or establishing one rule versus another.
that's right. There's a lot to talk about there. The state of Washington brought a lawsuit on this exact point. It tried to do a little analysis to determine how many state resources would be required to do a birth certificate check on every baby being born, and then trying to distinguish between those who qualify and those who don't qualify for basic medical care. Just that issue alone at the time of birth was going to cost the state hundreds of millions of dollars every year and billions over time. And they're like, what are you talking about? This is
Yeah,
nuts.
and the reason
Okay.
they're doing it, they're not just doing it because they want to. It's to comply with the Supreme Court's precedent on standing and on
Yep.
this universal injunction point about indivisible relief, whether or not courts have the authority to grant a broader set of relief. And so they had to explain how having the policy exist in any state would affect like the state of Washington or whatever. And yeah, you can imagine a situation in which they have a state legal obligation to provide these services to individuals, and to the extent that like someone moving into the state from another state where that they never had that the documents,
Yeah.
but they have a legal obligation to provide the services. That's going to cost the wages of the clerk to figure that out. That's going to cost the wages of the lawyer to litigate out whether or not there's a rightful claimant. And so those are the kinds of issues that are bound up in some of these differences in policies. But sorry again to interrupt. It's just so much of what you're saying is very interesting.
Yeah. So the Hume's point is to then say that the most legitimate form of government is that once a child or a poor person is born into a polity, that over time, the polity works with that person in such a way that consent is then given. That becomes the best form of government, right? Again, it doesn't have to be democracy. That's kind of his point. You might be born into a system that isn't democratic in nature, but still affords you the ability to give consent over time to be part of the polity or not be part of the polity. Although he recognizes that rejecting the polity then becomes complicated if you're a poor person because you have nowhere to go. So that's just
No,
sort of
no,
the logic and the logistics of
and
the
it
thing.
is a different sort
Um,
of consent than what we usually see in the context of like a lot of these legal principles, which is like you consent before the action is taken and at a discrete point in time, as opposed to over the course of a life or several years.
which is a good point because rhetorically, you could do some of these flurries to say like America doesn't consent to this, right? That consent can somehow be abstracted into something different. Again, the vagueness of words, right? So you can do fun rhetorical things that are effective for people who have a hard intuition one way or the other on topics like this. You can use a little bit of concept creep to accomplish your
The
rhetorical
concept
goals.
of
And I think it's
sexual
important.
morality, right? And applying the concepts of sexual morality and consent in that situation to a context of like
Right.
nationwide consent. Like, it's not clear to me that that concept is applicable in that domain. It would be like applying a notion of human based sexual morality consent to like animals or to who knows whether that even is a concept that ought be applicable in certain domains, or indeed among a group of people talking about complex issues such as citizenship.
And I'll just mention here too, there's a whole branch of philosophy that's just looking at the concept of words and like where the boundaries are on those words. And of course, it's very hard to find necessary and sufficient conditions
Yeah.
to justify any particular definition under any circumstances. But the only reason I say this is it is useful as we think about political rhetoric and online rhetoric to remember that there could be this kind of sleight of hand where you take a concept that seems to be well understood, move it up a couple of levels, and you've really broken down the
Yes,
logic of that
100%.
concept. And I think that better thinking and better philosophical roots that are simpler and are smaller rules are the better ones. And so I'll just kind of float that out. All right, now let's get into the actual history. So again, my contention is the philosophical underpinnings of the American project, of what it means to be an American, includes this notion that at the moment of birth, we enter the world equal, and we are not totally committed to the notion that my father determines my destiny. Obviously, my father will affect my destiny, but he does not determine it. If I am rich, I can ruin my family fortune. And if I am poor, I can become a titan of industry. That is what the American dream is predicated upon. And I think that this birthright citizenship stuff attacks that very fountain of liberty, of freedom, of the American dream. And I think it's gross. I think it's so psychotic. It's shocking to me how many people are signing up for this right now. I just can't understand it.
Yeah, yeah, no. The American dream, in so many words, is to rise above your station, to rise above the humble roots, not be bound by the mistakes of your forefathers. In a way, the story of America is kind of like an emancipation from a father, right? A distant father, a father who wasn't doing what needed to be done in the context of the king, let's say. And there very much is, and even in the current rules that we operate, the influence of the father. And we have a bedrock of English common law. But we are different as a country. And every
We are.
individual, for better or worse, right? For better or worse, how many stories
Yeah.
of people who have squandered their family legacy? Think about, have you seen The Jinx? This is Robert Durst, the story of Robert Durst, who became this murderer or whatever. And there's many stories like that, rags to riches, but also falls from grace. It's Greek, it's tragic, it's epic, but that is, I think, in so many words, a foundational concept of America that we are not bound to do as our forefathers did, or indeed our parents did. We aren't them. We are different than them. I went to the next slide, but you can respond.
Okay.
Sorry.
So British common law in Calvin's case. So this is in 1606, the English king granted the colonists of Virginia by statute to, quote, have and enjoy all liberties, franchise, and immunities to all intents and purposes as if they had been abiding and born within our realm of England. So Americans, colonists, were granted a special dispensation by the king of citizenship because why? They were not born in Great Britain.
Right.
So this is important. The original colonists, by leaving Great Britain and having children on the continental US, they were in a position where their children were not British citizens until the king gave a specific dispensation for such, because British law had in mind that if you were born on British soil, that made you British. The situation in Calvin's case happens 2 years later, 1608. This is a Scottish. So I just wrote it out this way. Did birth in Scotland make Calvin an alien with respect to England? Or did allegiance to the same monarch make him a natural-born English subject? Okay, so the word allegiance pops up. This is important.
Because people are using, just like with the term consent, people are using the term allegiance to mean something more loose, like politically aligned in like their worldview, or in that kind of way. But yeah, tell us about this obedience and allegiance concept, because you do see it in these foundational sort of cases.
So the Chancellery Court and the English Court of Kings, they held that Calvin was not an alien. He was a natural-born subject of the king and could hold land in England. The court said allegiance is owed to the person of the sovereign, not to a geographic territory as such. And this is, to me, this is what allegiance meant in historical terms. Anyone born under the king's obedience, that is, within his dominions and protection, owes natural allegiance and is therefore a natural-born subject. Okay, dominions and protections.
Mm-hmm.
If I live in a jurisdiction, which is a word that will matter a lot here in a minute, the jurisdiction determines who I have to obey and who is obliged to protect me. That's the dominion and the protection.
It goes back and forth.
Has to
you give allegiance, and in return you get protection.
That's right. And so to say that there isn't an allegiance, that means the person would therefore have no obligation to follow the laws of the domain, and the sovereign has no necessity to give any sort of protection. So that's the common law birth of birthright citizenship. Like that's where it came from. Calvin's case, 1608.
Slow really down. So because people might take from this, I think, the wrong impression, because think about the 1606 special dispensation to Virginia by statute. Well, Virginia, like Scotland, isn't that part of the king's domain in 1606? And so isn't it redundant to make this statute if it really isn't about territorial jurisdiction as such? Or is it the case, and maybe you have an answer to this, I don't know if I have an answer to this, that these colonies were something else, that the colonies worked under a charter and it wasn't necessarily the king's domain as understood at that time, such that there is no contradiction between what we're saying? So you tell us. Or is there a change in the law or change in understanding in this time?
Yeah, so Calvin's case is the change in the law.
Yeah.
So remember, the original statute in 1606 had to give special dispensation to the colonists. And Calvin's case in 1608 now creates the common law right of birthright natural citizenship. So you won't find lots of new statutes that are rolling out to help define this in individual colonies. After Calvin's case, this is actually how the whole British Empire is now governed, right? So this common law picks up on what the king was already doing. As is often the case in British common law, there were statutory developments and there were British common law developments happening intertwined, and that's what's happening here. I just use this as a point to show in the history that blood did not give the citizenship in the British mind, okay? Who the dad was not the determining factor. Who the mom was not the determining factor. If mom and dad were the determining factor, you would have needed no dispensation in 1606, and the court in Calvin's case would have come to a different conclusion.
Right. So the question that these two things present, it isn't a question of the parentage. It's a question of allegiance by virtue of where you are born. If you're born in Virginia, regardless of whether or not you needed a statute to get there, it fundamentally has to do with whether or not you're part of the realm, that is to say, the territory that is governed, over which the king has dominion. And yes, there's this change in Calvin's case that will make it common law, that is to say, judge-made law, that it's everywhere, and we don't need these new statutes. But the point of this is the English common law was not centered, at least at this time, on blood relationships.
That's right. Now, I'll note that inside of Calvin's case, they start this distinction of allegiances, which is just another way of saying jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Okay. Because they talk about a natural allegiance and a local allegiance. The local allegiance has to do with foreigners present in the realm. Well, what does that mean? They are not talking about tourists. They're talking about diplomats from France, a French person who comes to Great Britain as a
To
French
be a
person
representative.
to do things inside of jolly old England. That person is a temporary, and he is a foreigner. He's not a person who was vacationing in jolly old and has a child. That person would be underneath the natural allegiance theory and not the local allegiance theory. And so we start to see that there is an exception. That's my point.
Yeah.
We'll see this exception play out. Now, this is just the beginnings of the British common law, and it's why the colonies, and at the time of the Revolution, they were arguing for their rights as natural-born British citizens. And that was because of these concepts. They were not because the charter required them to be citizens.
Right.
Or
No,
it wasn't because they had 5 generations hence a British grandfather or something, right? That was not what gave them their citizenship. It was the common law, Calvin's case. That's how that works. Next slide.
No, beautiful. We'll get to the next slide, but there's a question that says, Pisco, can you explain the difference between this explanation and what Ryan was pushing in the word war debate concerning allegiance? So this is basically what we're suggesting, and I think what Nate is doing a good job of explaining, is that allegiance doesn't mean loyalty in the sense of you are loyal to the king. You're like a good, you follow the king in the sense of your ideas, you have your own independent ideas are related to being loyal to the king. He was trying to push the notion that that there's something more specific about your disposition to the king, or in this case, right, the United States of America. Whereas this seems to suggest more of a legal obligation in where the sovereign has power, and that allegiance relates to that mutual set of obligation. The government has an obligation to protect you, and you have an obligation to follow the law. In other words, just a synonym for jurisdiction. But Nate, I'll let you take that question as well. What's the difference between this notion of allegiance and whatever, I don't know if you watched that debate on birthright citizenship, whatever Ryan was arguing for there? Or what you hear about this?
No, I didn't watch it. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, don't worry. You hear people who are making these arguments say political allegiance. Allegiance is something other than being born in a place.
Yeah, it's concept drift. So allegiance it's like a term of art. It has like a very specific kind of, it describes a relationship. It doesn't describe consent. So it's not intellectual assent or consent of loyalty to a person.
Right.
It describes a relationship that is defined by treaty. So like, what is an alliance? Right? An alliance between countries is defined by a relationship that they've written down that shows obligations and responsibilities.
Yes.
So allegiance has to do, again, with obedience within the dominion and protection. So there's 2 edges to this. So you say, since I'm inside of the dominion of the sovereign, I'm within its boundaries, I now have an obligation to follow the law, and the sovereign has an obligation back to me for protection. That's what that means in this context.
Yeah.
If we just use allegiance to be like, oh, I'm so loyal
to Trump
to the
or to the United States,
yeah, like, so, you can try to do these word drift, concept drifts on stuff like this, but this is a term of art where it's an allegiance is like an alliance between countries defined by treaty. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not like a baby does not assent to anything. It doesn't have the capacity. Like, what are we talking about?
Yeah, that was the point that I was driving in that debate, and I think it's so crucial to remember that allegiance needs to be something that a baby can have. Whatever this concept of allegiance is, and there's a moment in that debate, Nate, that I think you should watch, where I ask Ryan, where does someone get allegiance? And he says, well, you sign up for the draft, don't you? And I thought that was the silliest thing I've ever heard. I'm like, well, hang on. First of all, half of America doesn't because they're women. and non-binaries, and the other, and you don't do it till you're 18. You don't do it till you're 18, and it was such. Now, when he said that, when Ryan said, "Well, you sign up for the draft, don't you?" He got. You don't hear it as much on the recording, but the crowd all, yeah, the draft, because he's just appealing to this kind of like militarism, or this respect that we have for our service and of being a man, perhaps. But it really is just an incoherent response. I think that political allegiance, turns on your ability or willingness, or you're signing up to be, able to be drafted in the military sense. But yeah, I'll let you respond to that as well before we go on.
Okay, yeah. I mean, again, it's just a concept drift issue. And so that person created an arbitrary rule that is not connected to reality to try to make his thinking work. The reason I say that that makes no sense is, well, just let immigrants sign up for the draft then. Like if it's about consenting to the king, I can tell you right now, the number of illegal immigrants who would sign up for the military tomorrow is legion. You
Yeah.
wouldn't need a draft. They would sign up
They
immediately.
would say
Like,
that was Rome.
what are
That's
we
what
talking?
happened. That's what happened in Rome. They let all these people get in. But there's something really key what you just said though that they would take issue with, and I want you to respond to it because I think it's insane. They're like, "Well, this is all well and good, Nate. You're describing the rules of the king, the rules of subjecthood." Now I respond and I say, "Yes, yes, that is what we did, and that's like you can disagree with them, but that is what we were importing. But the notion is somehow we shouldn't be adopting these rules of subjecthood." Since we
Sure.
overthrew the king. Response to that.
So, yeah, we will see that the American colonists, as they become a nation, and the individual states, they start to take an American version of these concepts. So you're going to see that we end up, because I think somebody in chat sort of mentioned this. It's almost like the king owned you. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the part of the problem, right? So part of the issue was this notion of allegiance had to do with these two-way relationships that were enforced by these concepts of a divine right to rule. So like it's not a clean evolution. We were going from a context where British citizens prior to Magna Carta were just property of the sovereign in your locality. Everyone is a serf. Everyone's a peon, right? Like that's okay. Magna Carta comes, and now we get a new concept of the relationship between citizens, which were very limited in 1200, and the king, right? Versus 1600. We're going through a natural evolution into Enlightenment thought that says, hey, wait a minute, maybe the relationship between king and person should be less about coercion, bloodlines, violence, and divine right. Maybe it should be something a little bit different. And so these are steps, small steps to move to a different governing model where it isn't so much about I'm the property of the king and he does what he wants with me. It is a step to I have responsibilities to the king and he has responsibilities back,
Yes,
right?
it's a different gloss on it for sure, and
Yeah.
it's a different conceptualization of it. But the influence of the rules of subjecthood are undeniable there. And but yes, America
Yeah.
will go different places with it, as eventually we'll get to, I'm sure, with the rule on American Indians. But yeah, let me switch the slides. Sorry for belaboring that point, but thank you for the question.
No, it's a good point. It's a good point. So if we then go to American history, I think this is one of the great early cases. So you don't hear much about this because it's just been the custom on inside the colonies for over 200 years before the founding, right? That this is how citizenship occurs. So I put in here in 1698, the British Parliament naturalized the children of subjects who were born abroad while the parents were in the king's service. So there was this problem of if the rule in Calvin's case says that you're supposed to be getting citizenship through being present in the realm and being allied with the king in that relationship. What about everyone who's born abroad? And the answer is the British had to create this new statutory rule, which says, well, we're going to create a legal fiction. And the king's servants serving abroad take a little piece of England with them, right? And so embassies and soldiers on conquered territory or inside of a military installation become the constructive property of the king through the statutory reform in the late 1600s.
And two key parts of that. One is the kind of limited way in which that occurs, and the need for a statute. And second is to look at the comparison to other sorts of situations that are thought of as closely linked to rights. And the best, I think, example of that is voting in the context of overseas military people. Because you can imagine a military service member who's been serving overseas for years abroad and would probably fail if they were a normal citizen under like a domicile test or residency test for whatever, for purposes of like following the law in the state of voting. But there's this kind of notion of constructive presence that you're only there because you're serving your country, et cetera, et cetera. And so you take a little bit of the land with you. So it applies in limited cases where the country decides to put that into law, enact it into law. And of course, nowadays, we have laws and rules about that, both that are even broader than just, you're doing this for military and you're just doing this for diplomatic stuff. That goes so far as if you have a parent who's an American who's been here at least some arbitrary amount of time, even just one parent, and I think it's easier for if you have a mom than a dad, or it's easier to prove or something. It's different there. But yeah, the rules have now expanded. But it's, I think, cementing a concept, and you can tell me if you agree, that to go beyond the edges of the normal rules of dominion, the normal birthright, citizenship, English common law rule, there need to be these developments, or there needs to be ways to creatively map the concept onto new situation and phenomena.
That's right. And it's also important if you're a large country that does a lot of foreign work, then obviously these types of edge cases become more numerous. All right. In the United States, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which, by the way, included you could only become a U.S. citizen if you weren't born on the soil, if you were a white male. So this was racist. This is a racist law. I just want to highlight that. But even inside of the racist statute, it says the following: the children of citizens of the United States that may be born beyond the sea shall be considered as natural born citizens. Because again, the thing that is extending citizenship to the early Americans is not who your dad is. That is not the test. The test is, do we have this little constructive piece of something that's going abroad with you? Here, to clear up any sort of confusion, the Naturalization Act extends that, just as the British had done 100 years prior, right? And so I just mention this, that even inside the racist Naturalization Act of 1790, that says if you weren't born inside the United States and you want to become a citizen and you are a black male, that's not happening. If you are a woman, that is not happening, right? And so there were restrictions on naturalization. Fair enough. It's not to say that the early Americans were egalitarian as it came to citizenship. They were not. But that the underlying rationale remained the same 200 years after Calvin's case. That's my point.
Okay, it's a point well taken. And it's also important to note here that we didn't need the 14th Amendment for Congress to be able to do this kind of stuff, because, of course, Article 1 of the Constitution, among the enumerated powers of Congress, is to set the rules of naturalization. And that is one of the few references to citizenship in the original Constitution. There are others, of course, there, about the requirements to be president and the requirements to be a representative, et cetera, et cetera. If for president specifically, you need to be a natural-born citizen, and at some point, maybe you can tell us what a natural-born citizen is. Actually, why don't I just say what I think it is, and you tell me if this is wrong, that in the state of nature, when you existed in the state of nature, that is, when you were born, you were a citizen at the moment you existed in the state of nature. I don't know if that's true, but that's at least what I think it probably, or maybe there's something there. But yeah, so Congress can do this without the 14th Amendment, and without adjusting the English common law rule, which is the judge. When you ever see common law, judge made law. And they did so using their Article 1 authorities. But yeah, continue on and tell us about Lynch versus Clark, or respond to what I said.
By the way, just British common law came with the force of the king. I mean, this is one of the things that happened as a consequence of Magna Carta. The king, even if he wasn't the originator of the new law, he was still forced to back it up. And so there was a whole relationship there.
Right,
anyway,
right.
I digress.
Yes.
So Lynch v. Clark, 1844, right? This is prior to the 14th Amendment. This is an illustration of the point. So my conclusion upon the facts provided is that Julia Lynch was born in this state of alien parents during their temporary sojourns, that they came here as an experiment without any settled intention of abandoning their native country or of making the United States their permanent abode. They never concluded to remain here permanently, and after trying the country, they returned to their native land. and there ended their lives many years afterwards. They took Julia with them to Ireland. She continued to reside there, and when Thomas Lynch died, she was about 14 years of age and a resident of Ireland. Upon principles, therefore, I
I can
can
entertain
entertain
no.
no doubt. Yeah, but that by law of the United States, every person born within the dominions and allegiances, again, we know what allegiances mean. This is not in the colloquial sense of
Yes.
loyalty fanaticdom for a particular party or a particular president or something crazy like that. Of the United States, whatever were the intentions of the parents, is a natural born citizen. It is surprising that there has been no judicial decision upon this question. None we found by the counsel who argued this case. Well, why is that? Because it had been the tradition for
Right.
250 years. Right? Like, that's why. It's because that's how every person in that courtroom had gotten their citizenship. That's the whole point, anyway.
It was
In conclusion,
assumed.
I entertain no doubt that the Julia Lynch was a citizen of the United States when Thomas Lynch died. She therefore inherited the property in controversy. If Thomas Lynch had any estate therein to the entire exclusion of the complaint, who was then an alien and incapable of taking by descent. Okay,
It's
whatever. So
beautiful. It's
it's a
beautiful for
property issue.
so many reasons. Yeah. And I'm assuming that there's some like rule about whether or not the property, they inherit the property unless they're a citizen. There might be something there. So in the course of coming to a dispute about some property, they're determining this legal issue, which had been assumed for so long. What's so beautiful about this is it totally debunks the main arguments from Trump, which have to do with the intention of the parents, number one. So this is saying regardless of their intent, regardless of what they wanted to do. And it specifically debunks this notion of domicile, right? What is domicile? Domicile is the physical presence and the intent to stay someplace permanently, to make it your permanent home. You can think of domicile as almost a synonym for permanent home. If you had to do it in a couple of words, permanent home. And Lynch versus Clark, this decision that's being pointed to, specifically disclaims that. It doesn't matter if you were domiciled in America, that the rule is, even if you were there temporarily as an experiment and
Yeah.
you just left afterwards,
Yeah.
you were given citizenship by dint of your birth in the United States.
Mom and dad don't determine my destiny. Like, that's the rule. Like, anyway, it's frustrating to me that this is even a conversation, but nonetheless. All right, next one. In a 1866 debate surrounding the 14th Amendment,
We're past the
terrible
Civil
misuse of
War.
the following. And
Yeah,
you will,
I just want to center us historically.
Yeah.
So we just had this big Civil War. Part of the Civil War was premised on this decision, Dred Scott, which was about citizenship, right? It was about whether or not black people, members of the slave race, could be citizens of the United States. I mean, in so many words, this was a fight long coming. And one of the reasons why the Constitution might not have defined citizenship is specifically to prevent it from blowing up, and think also about the 3/5 compromise, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But center us historically. This is post-Civil War. What's happening? What are they deciding?
Well, and I guess I should say too, so the British common law and the history allowed for what I can gather are four exceptions, right, to this birthright citizenship. So the four exceptions are the following: an arbitrary exception that refers to chattel slavery Africans. Okay.
Yeah.
So they were just categorically out. By the way, Dred Scott, like there was a whole series of debates around this topic. Once a slave is free, can they naturalize? And if a free slave has black children, are they citizens? Right. So
Yeah.
there's actually an interesting bit of law around all that. And of course, Dred Scott tries to say you can't naturalize someone born into slavery.
Yeah, it was wild.
But at the same time,
it was a radical decision, and one that, for purposes of the debate, was trying to quote unquote settle the issue. But yeah, go ahead, sir.
right, and of course, it's many people at the time thought that that was the real domino that created a chain of events to the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, people at the time thought that. This isn't historians looking backwards. People fighting the Civil War referenced Dred Scott as one of the reasons why they were fighting the Civil War. So it's important to note that it was a bad decision. I think everybody in hindsight, even at the time, most people thought it was a bad decision. But it was trying to achieve a political goal instead of a logical, well-reasoned legal opinion. And that's important because I think that what the Trump folks are asking for is another version of Dred
Yes.
Scott, that we need a political outcome. And the best way to get that political outcome is to have justices look the other way on the history and the law, and instead just make an arbitrary decision that is politically useful in the moment.
So
And
it's yeah.
that is a good domino for public strife.
I totally agree, and it's certainly what these people were trying to avoid after this bloody conflict in the Civil War. It's 1866. Lincoln has been assassinated. We're years from Gettysburg, where Lincoln promised a new birth of freedom, and the radical Republicans are considering a new rule on birthright citizenship. Or is it a new rule on birthright citizenship? What were they trying to achieve here, Nate?
Well, so this is in order to make it abundantly clear that that exception of blacks chattel slavery is no longer an exception, they create the 14th Amendment. Now, there's three other exceptions that are still out in the air.
Right.
Okay. One of those is what we've already talked about, which is the idea that there is a legal fiction that certain ambassadors and agents of foreign governments take a little piece of that government or that territory with them. So that remains the case. The third were invaders. Now, this has never come up in American law, but it is an exception. So a foreign invader, an alien invader, and I don't mean colloquially invading, right? I mean,
it's another term
of
art.
Weapons.
Yeah.
Yeah, another term of art. I'm talking about I am from Mexico. I have weapons. I am taking territory from the United States by way of invasion. Once I have taken a town in, let's say, Texas, I move my family in, and my wife has a child there. Years later, the United States, through military action, takes the town back.
A reconquista.
Reconquers, yeah. And so, of course, this isn't, in my opinion, it's not even an exception, but it is, you could conceive of it as an exception where an alien, a foreign invader, has taken territory from the United States, and therefore allegiance doesn't track because they're foreign invaders and they've conquered the territory. The territory is no longer subject to the dominion of the sovereign of the United States, right? So like that just sort of makes sense to me. It's not even an exception, but it is mentioned in the literature.
It's just an operation of the rule. Yeah, no, I understand that it's sort of categorized as an exception, but I just think it sort of follows the rule that established it in the first place. And so I agree with you that it's better thought of as an operation of the rule than specifically speaking like an exception to it. And yeah, I think that absolutely follows. And America has been invaded before. War of 1812. I think there have been incursions by Mexicans in certain places for sure, from like the Mexican government sense, right? But it's never come into sort of any relevance because we've never had like a long-term permanent occupation. Think about the following, to get a very not politically fraught example, the West Bank. Okay, think about the English common rule if it were to be applied in the West Bank context. Do we think that the Israeli settlers would be citizens of Palestine under the English common law rule, not citizens of Israel, right? But yeah, okay, they're citizens of Israel. Would they be still citizens of Palestine if it were ever created by virtue of some treaty? Well, under the English common law rule, I think the answer would be no, that there would need to be some sort of separate arrangement to make them citizens of Palestine if they even wanted to be, right? At least as it operates. But those are the kinds of conditions you can think of embracing that rule exception, however you want to conceive it.
Well, I have intentionally tried not to think about
sure.
The consequences of citizenship in an ethno-state context.
Yeah.
Because I think all ethno-states are de facto illegitimate, so I'm not a big fan.
I hear you. Be very careful because you're gonna have people in the chat calling you tanky. Yeah, you don't. And of course, Native is not a.
Well, I don't like. That's why I say, but I have not thought about it. I haven't really looked into the Israeli context in particular. I haven't looked into like North Korea. Like, what are the alternative models that are operative today for extending citizenship? I haven't looked into lots of those.
That is what some of these people want, right? They do want to embrace a more ethno-state model, and on that view, this makes perfect sense, right? Getting rid of this rule would accomplish the goal of creating an ethno-state, or at least partway through to create an ethno-state if you're going to base it as, like, for example, Chris Rufo, on some sort of connection to the founding stock or something like that. Maybe it's not
Yeah.
a facial, like a technically ethno rule if it's like some kind of accident of being part of the founding generation, but they do sort of more want to approximate the Israeli form of or conception of citizenship. Or I know they give citizenship to certain Arab populations, Palestinian populations, but just as an example. But yeah, I totally agree with you
I
that
don't.
it's illiberal, and yeah.
Yeah, I don't. I like it. I shouldn't even mention this, but I've become obsessed with the Third Reich. So
Flip it.
I've been listening to the Ian Crenshaw. I know, I know. I'm such a, like, what am I? I'm a stereotype. I'm just like a walking stereotype. Anyway, so I've been listening to the Ian Crenshaw 2-volume biography of Hitler. So Ian Crenshaw, he's passed away, but this was a 1998 publication. I just asked ChatGPT, what is the most scholarly biography of Hitler, and what has been cited to the most in academic literature? And they came up and it told me Ian Crenshaw, and it's 47 hours. Okay, so I am 39 hours deep. One of the interesting things that this issue touches on, one, Hitler almost got deported. Did you know this? This blew my mind.
Yes. Because he was born in Austria, and the
He
question
was born in
arose
Austria.
by virtue of, I think, of his service, right? Or whether or not he was able to be
Yeah.
a member of the something with his military service. You tell us.
That's right. So yeah, Hitler does this putsch in 1924 where he tries to
The
take
beer hall
over the
pooch.
local government of Munich. Yeah, like a freaking weirdo, and it doesn't go well. He then goes to court and they find him guilty of trying to overthrow the government because that's what he tried to do. Of course, he ends up going to jail
And
and
gets a slap on the
writes Mein
wrist.
Kampf.
Another example of why we need to punish these people more. He gets a slap on the wrist for the beer hall
Yeah.
putsch. He's out in a year. He writes Mein Kampf in
Yes.
yeah.
The judge who took it so easy on him becomes the chief justice of the highest court in
Oh, you're
Germany during the
kidding.
Third Reich.
Oh, you're
Anyway,
kidding. Yeah,
digress.
and
No, of
it's
course.
important. It's important to note, by the way, it's not like the courts stopped working during the Third Reich. They created, I think, a new court for certain matters, but as between equals in Nazi Germany, unless there was some great interest from the Nazi state, it is funny because there are conflicts that are being resolved in Nazi Germany as between Germans using certain ordinary processes of law, notwithstanding the existence of the Nazi state. And so it just goes to show you, like, this notion of club membership, this notion of being a citizen and being an equal, even in the context of Nazi Germany, it meant that you could get the protection of the law in some cases against other Germans, unless really the state took an interest in it. They're not interfering that way. Go ahead.
No, those are fascinating points. I actually would love. We should do nobody would care, but usually you and I should do a stream where we just go through the history of the Third Reich's legal system, because it's wild. Anyway, so at the end of the trial, he gets thrown in jail. I think it was for like a 3-year term, but he ended up only serving like 2 years. Anyway, the prosecution moved for his deportation after the light sentence, and the judge said, "Well, I understand your point, and you're right. He should be deported, but I'm going to use my discretion because of his great service during World War I and his being honored the Black Cross or whatever, because he'd been injured twice.
Or something,
Yeah, he was injured twice, including he was actually temporarily blinded because of a mustard gas attack. And so he got the Iron Cross twice, and he said, because he's such a great German patriot, I will allow him to stay." So, like, I don't even know if Hitler ever actually got German citizenship.
And it shows you the danger. No, I totally agree, and I think it's funny to note that it's possible that he was an illegal immigrant, right, or whatever. But even putting that aside,
no, he was.
Yes, he was.
Hitler was an illegal immigrant in Germany. That's what he was.
It shows you the danger of having a test that is not cold, as you say, but elastic to people's own conceptions of, well, he is patriotic. And of course, can't deport a patriotic person. A patriotic person is a citizen.
I was just going to say, so the reason I brought this up in the first place is, so Hitler, now he's in charge by 1935. He's in charge of the country. And he and Himmler and Goebbels sit down, and they cannot figure out how to determine what a Jew is.
Yes. This is the Nuremberg laws. And it's actually
Yeah.
a difficult conceptual issue. So the Nuremberg laws on citizenship, they tell you with respect to how many different permutations of lineage from Jewish, Aryan, other parents would make you or classify you as a given category, subject to an assumption of what a Jew is, which is never explained. And this goes to
Yeah.
show you that these concepts, right? These concepts are human-made concepts. They cohere with certain patterns that humans see, but it actually is difficult to like fully suss out, well, what is a citizen? That's why I keep going back to this club thing,
Yeah.
because I don't really have a better analogy for it. It's like being part of a club. It's like being a member of the in-group or a member of the tribe. But beyond that, it's kind of hard to analytically bedrock it, just like, being Jewish. I mean, like, what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean? And then it becomes a problem again by 1939. They conquer half of Poland. They're about to conquer the rest of it. And then they start invading the Slavic countries and all this other stuff. And so Hitler, they never did anything in writing, but he has these conversations where he wants to create a tiered system where the Jews are at the bottom, people of color are right above them, and then there's like the Slavs and the
Yeah.
Gypsies, and then there's the Aryans. And they all of his legal guys were like, we don't know how to, like, how are we going to do this? Like, there's no way that I can tell you that a Ukrainian is somehow different than a German. And how would you go about knowing? If we're going to force them to learn German, like right now we can kind of tell because of the language they speak and their
Yeah.
history. But over time, as we conquer the rest of the world, how will we figure out who the Aryans are? And they couldn't figure it
And
out.
it would have been harder even in Germany, where a lot of Jews had more like culturally assimilated. Think about like the Jews in
Yeah,
France and Jews in Germany, kind of different culturally than the Jews in more Eastern Europe, which maybe were more easy, like at a glance, to distinguish, but it can be tougher. And even
right.
in this context, right, like the ICE agents, who in my opinion murdered Alex Preddy, etc., they were Hispanic, right? So like there can be come sort of a sense that it's not easily distinguishable who's a member of the club, which brings us back to this rule and this argument, because this is one of the things that I contended with in the debate. One of the things that I thought would appeal more to a MAGA audience is this notion of workability, is this notion of they wanted an administratable rule. And after the Civil War, yes, it was the case they wanted to overturn Dred Scott. How would you do that? An amendment, certainly. But they didn't stop there. They didn't just say, and freed slaves and black people shall be allowed to be citizens given they comply with the other requirements of citizenship. They went beyond that and they used general language. And I argue that one of the policy reasons they did this, in addition to overturning Dred Scott, was to settle a certain set of issues and to make a rule that is administratable and workable, which was the rule they were familiar with, and to set it as a matter of constitutional provision. And that's what I think a lot of these
Yeah.
debates, which have been misinterpreted, indicate. But yeah, tell us about this debate and about the 14th Amendment here.
Okay. So there's this terrible misuse of the following. So Mr. Howard presents the 14th Amendment. The First Amendment is to Section 1, declaring all persons, blah, blah, blah. I do not suppose. So there's all this stuff. The key phrase here is in the second paragraph. This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers accredited to the government of the United States,
Yep.
but will include every other class of persons, period. So just, I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, it's the day that I messaged you and was like, I need to talk about this. Some senator from Missouri, some psychopath, some racist guy makes the statement that that sentence allows for the government to reinterpret the 14th Amendment and start including all of the people who are born to parents who enter the United States without permission.
And it's not
And of
just him
course, I'm
either.
like, okay, first of all,
I interacted the one or two only. I think it might be my last encounter. It is my last encounter with Charlie Kirk. He added me with this particular thing. So this quote from Howard is being circled around, and it's so terrible of an argument. But I'm going to let you make it because it is shocking.
so two things about this. One, this is not a written statement. So these are from the
Yes.
notes of a person who's taking down just him extemporaneously introducing the bill, right? So the punctuation on this, the commas, are
Discretion
not
of the
meaningful. That
yes,
is
it is the discretion of the person transcribing.
That's right. So this isn't like Mr. Howard put in these commas that would somehow indicate that foreigners, aliens who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers are somehow discrete, independent categories or groups. And so I think that because of how it's written with the commas, people who are motivated, because they're not actually interested in the law, they're interested in the result. So the people who are interested in the result of denying people citizenship and entrance into the polity are doing so because they're just trying to find any little piece of language that they can gin up to justify their horrific position. And so they're trying to use these offsetting commas as a way to do that. Of course, that's not the case.
But even
The
in the
next
English
slide
language
shows
with those commas, I forget the exact. There's a phrase for this kind of thing where even if you read this as a text, right? Even if you did that, and this was deliberately done, you can offset another word which describes the previous word. So if you were to say, yes, with commas. So you say something like domestic animals, pets, right? And then it's clear that you're when you don't have an and at the end
same
there,
category.
that it's the same thing, and or just another word for the previous thing. And so this sentence doesn't make any sense if you read it as foreigners, comma, aliens, comma, who belong to. Who belong to, of course, has to modify something. It's not a self-standing thing, and there's no and there. And it also would be redundant to say foreigners and aliens who belong to families of ambassadors, because, of course, you could just say foreigners. And also, one other thing, sorry, I'm almost taking your thunder here. This is even wrong by Howard's own lights, right? Because this is referencing persons born who belong to families of ambassadors, and of course the 14th Amendment applies to babies. It applies to babies, and this particular quote sometimes conflates the babies with their parents, and that, I think, crucially is a problem.
Right.
Go for it.
Which, by the way, because again, these are just people riffing on the Senate floor. So if you go to the next slide, there's a riff on this exact topic.
Yep.
So on the next slide, we've got a situation where somebody by the name so Howard says, quote, undoubtedly, the expression is used in both those instances, referring to different use cases that people were talking about on the debate floor, in the sense in which it employed in the amendment now before us. A citizen of the United States is held by the courts to be a person who was born within the limits of the United States and subject to their laws. So during the same debate, many paragraphs down, Howard says, look, I'm not changing the rule as it's been outlaid by the courts, which we've just gone through, right?
Yep.
So Mr. Fresden, jumping ahead again, suppose a person is born here of parents from abroad temporarily in this country. Mr. Wade, a co-sponsor to the amendment. The senator says a person may be born here and not be a citizen. I know that is so in one instance, in the case of the children of foreign ministers who reside near the United States in the diplomatic language. By a fiction of law, such persons are not supposed to be residing here, and under that fiction of law, their children will not be citizens of the United States, although born in Washington. I agree to that. But my answer to the suggestion is that it is a simple matter, for it could hardly be applicable to more than 2 or 3 or 4 persons, and it would be best not to alter the law for that case. I will let it come under the well-known maxim of the law, de maximis lex non curat. Guys, like, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that this would include visitors who just want to hang out and leave. They knew that. It was on the debate floor. Don't use the debate notes as some sort of a justification for the debauchery of the 14th Amendment.
Yeah,
it's crazy to me.
In review, not only do they misread the debate, in my opinion, they ignore the debate, the parts of the debate which show clearly the intent was to reassert the English common law, to get rid of this of Dred Scott, and to make it the law of the land by virtue of constitutional provision, and to settle that. But also, even taking a step further back, from a judicial philosophy perspective, right? We have been told by so many of these conservatives and originalist jurists that legislative history, we shouldn't look to that, really not. And so there's a lot of great originalists' work which supports our position. And it's consistent in the sense of, like, what matters is the original public meaning of the operative text that was ratified by the people, right? The amendment is not passed until it's ratified by the people of the United States of America in the states, right? So if you're being consistent on the judicial philosophy, you shouldn't even look to this stuff necessarily as dispositive, except for the meaning of the words. But even if you were to look at the debates and the specific intentions of the framers, there's some talking past each other. There are some statements that you can misconstrue a certain way, but the overriding sentiment was, as Nate is describing, we're reasserting the common law rule. When pressed upon, hey, does this mean XYZ? They say, yeah, it does. We're not changing it.
Yeah. So I just want to highlight, because you will see this April 1st, everyone in chat, everyone who hears this, April 1st, 2026, the internet is going to give you slop thinking on this topic. It is going to be gross. And so remember these moments, because these are the things that people will be asserting. Well, the original intent, blah blah blah. It's all slop. You know the truth. These debates were had, and everyone was on the same page. There was no variation. If you jump to the next slide, we start to see cases come up where we now have a collision between immigration law and what. Yeah, this is too small. I'm realizing now. It's probably going to be hard to read. But the immigration laws start getting passed, and they start bumping up against the 14th Amendment. So I love this case. This is the citizenship of a person born in the United States of Chinese parents. In re Luc Tin Sing on habeas corpus. So this is a habeas corpus action coming out of California. Question: the citizenship of person born in the United States of Chinese parents. A person born within the U.S. of Chinese parents, residing therein, and not engaged in any diplomatic or official capacity under the Emperor of China, is a citizen of the United States. Pisco, why is this even relevant? Why is this coming up? Congress in 1880 had just passed the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Law, yeah.
They have made all Chinese non-citizens illegal.
Yep.
So let's rephrase this. The child of illegal Chinese parents, okay? 2, construction of words subject to jurisdiction thereof. In first clause of section 1 of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, persons are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States who are within their dominions and under the protection of their laws, with the consequent obligation to obey them. Oh, look, we're back to what the original dominion idea was, right? Yep. If I'm born in the dominion of a state, I have the obligation to obey laws, and the state has obligations to me. It's the same rationale 300 years later. This is, I mean, I don't know. I digress. The jurisdiction over these latter must, I jumped. So obligation to obey them with obedience can be rendered, but only those who are the subject by their birth or naturalization are within the terms of the amendment. So you either have to be naturalized or born. Number 3, original clause in the amendment. Previous to this amendment, the general doctrine, except as applies to Africans brought here and sold as slaves and their descendants, right? The arbitrary exception that it was racist nonsense, was the birth within the dominions and jurisdiction. Again, dominion and jurisdiction are synonymous terms of the United States of its self-created citizenship. The amendment was adopted as an authoritative declaration of this doctrine as to the white race, and also to do away with the exception as to Africans and their descendants.
Yeah, that's perfectly in line with what we're talking about. Yeah, it's the same stuff this entire time. It's not changing. And there's an additional component here that the 1880s brings up, and you mentioned it, which is the advent of new restrictive laws. Now, I take offense to a Wikipedia article because the Page Act was sort of classically understood as the first restrictive immigration law in the books. And now the Wikipedia article has changed, like, it's a myth, it's a myth, it's a myth. No, guys, no, guys, not in the sense that we mean. Yes, there were some state laws about contraband that were enforced. Yes, there was, and something crucially that I brought up in the debate, laws banning the importation of persons who are slaves into the country. Yeah. There were those laws, but not in the traditional immigration sense that they're now starting to come up. What does that lead to for 2 conclusions? First, conclusion number 1, we don't think in 1860s, before the first immigration restrictive law that we were thinking about was passed in 1875, the Page Act, that they were thinking this concept of jurisdiction, putting aside the historical pedigree of the concept that Nate has laid out, is turning on laws that weren't even on the books at the time that the 14th Amendment was ratified. But there's a second point here too, which is having to do with the very law that I'm talking about, banning international slave trade. Were the children of slaves who were brought here illegally, brought here illegally, in violation of the ban on the importation of slaves, are their children subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? I mean, they're illegally brought into the country. And the answer is, of course. Of course there are. And now Ryan's response in the debate was like, oh, that's dealing with like people who were brought here in the early 1800s. And no, they were importing slaves into the United States throughout that course. Lincoln executed a slave importer. The only person who's ever been executed for that was under Lincoln's administration in the 1860s.
Right.
And so if you take this view that being brought here illegally, which they think of a lot of these illegal immigrants being brought here in that sense, against the laws of the United States, without the consent of the United States, that somehow that would make you not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. You'd have to grant that the children of those slaves would not be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. But it's absurd, because if that's what's the test is, how could it be the case that by political allegiance we mean that loyalty in the sort of intellectual sense that you talked about, Nate, that someone stolen, kidnapped from Africa against their will, brought to this country against the laws of the United States, would have political allegiance in the loyalty sense to the United States government? Yeah. It is an absurdity. And we don't think that was in the minds of these people. They were thinking about this historical rule, and they weren't thinking about like modern immigration law. Sorry, go ahead. Rant over.
That's right. And again, I just want to be really clear. All of these arguments are cynical. They are looking for any sort of justification to get to a result. They're not interested in the law at all. This is not a legal argument. And so I don't even like that we have to get into the weeds of the legal arguments on this. I think non-lawyers should feel very comfortable to say, sounds like you're just trying to break the law. And you would be right.
Yes.
They are just trying to break the law. You don't need all of the history. You don't need all of the details to get there. But of course, the more you look at the weeds, the more outrageous this whole thing becomes.
Yep.
Oh, anyway, all right.
Go
next slide. Wong Kim Ark. I mean, this is
the case.
Be all over the Supreme Court decision. This is the big one, right? So again, this touches on a similar issue having to do with the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So this is right out of the Supreme Court's decision. I cited it there to the Oyas. They've got all the text. Quote, the Chinese Exclusion Acts denied citizenship to Chinese immigrants. Moreover, by treaty, no Chinese subject in the United States could become a naturalized citizen, which I thought was interesting. By treaty, I don't know the details on that. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to parents who were both Chinese citizens who resided in the United States at the time. At age 21, he returned to China to visit his parents who had previously resided in the U.S. for 20 years. So these are illegal immigrants who had a baby and then returned to China.
Legal? No, okay. They were legal. They were legal, right? They were here permanently, legally. I think that you misstated that real quick. I
don't know.
Permanent residents. True? I think they were permanent residents. Yeah, this is what they try to say. But I don't think you disagree.
Right. That's a term of art. This idea of legal permanent residence is a term of art. That means that you went through an application process and actually got some sort of.
I think they had papers though. I think they had papers to be here permanently. I could be wrong about that. You know what? I'm going to say I could be wrong about that. But what some people have argued is Wong Kim Ark. Yeah. We can accept the holding of Wong Kim Ark because Wong Kim Ark's parents were here legally. And that distinguishes the cases where they're here illegally. And they were here permanently. That's where this rule of like permanent residency is coming from, where they're trying to distinguish the holding of Wong Kim Ark and reject the reasoning of Wong Kim Ark, which is a kind of like sleight of hand that a lot of these people are doing. They're trying to pretend maintain the precedent. But I think that is the case. Yeah, but okay, you could know more than me.
I don't know. We have to think through this. So Chinese Exclusion Act drops 1880. I don't know when Wong Kim Ark's parents. So if he's 21 prior to 1898, let's just assume it went quickly and it was like 1896. Minus 21 would put us into the early 1870s. Okay, so I guess they could have entered the United States when we were an open borders country.
Right? Various sources say he was born in 1873, 1871, 1870, or 1868.
Yeah, so people are just trying to do the math based off of what the Supreme Court said, right? I don't know if we know his birthday. So nonetheless, okay, so fair enough. His parents entered the United States prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act. They would have had no paperwork because none would have been required.
Fair enough.
Right.
Okay. No, that's a good point. Fair enough.
Right. And then at some point they would have returned. When did they return? to China?
Right. Yeah. So they returned in the families returned to China may have been spurred by 1870 by the riot of 1877. So at the time, folks, there was a lot of like labor
Okay.
um, concerns in California and hatred of the Chinese people who were like working in laborers and stuff. And so it looks like in the late 70s they left, and he left in 1889 to go visit China or to return to the family farm and then come back eventually.
Yeah. Okay. So if we think through that, then what we had were temporary migrant workers who came to the United States, left due to racial prejudice because it
Right.
was an unsafe place for them. After they leave, the Chinese Exclusion Act indicates that no Chinese people can come to the United States legally. Their child returns to the United States at the age of 21 and is denied entry because all Chinese people should be excluded. And the Supreme Court says, quote, because Wong was born in the United States and his parents were not employed in any diplomatic or official capacity under the Emperor of China, close quote,
Mm-hmm.
the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment automatically makes him a U.S. citizen.
Yep.
So I don't know. I haven't read the dissents on this. Maybe I should go read the dissents. Maybe they talk about some of this stuff. I'm not sure. But to me, it would be very weird to construct an argument that somehow the parents were here legally, whatever that meant, I guess, in the mind of the person
I
making
think
the
not
argument. I don't know what they mean
illegally.
by that.
I think they would say it's like they weren't here against the law or something like
Okay.
that. Which
Right. Okay.
whatever the difference is
Okay.
there. But I will note something here that this excludes. In the debate I had with Ryan, so I mentioned this point about signing up for the draft, proving your allegiance. And so after he got owned at that point, he's like, oh well, allegiance follows that of the parents. But Wong Kim Ark specifically rejects that because, of course, the parents are subject to the Emperor of China, right? And so it can't
Yeah.
be that allegiance is merely whatever your parents' allegiance is. Because that, if you accept that Wong Kim Ark is good law, and when I said that, he said, well, Wong Kim Ark was poorly reasoned or something like that. But it's not clear why, under any vision of like a loyalty test, that the parents of Wong Kim Ark would be loyal in that sense either. So whatever the rule is, I think Wong Kim Ark forecloses a lot of these theories. And so that's why I think in order to uphold Trump's rule here, it's going to be either some procedural bullshit that I might not even be aware of, or they have to
Yeah.
take a hammer to the intellectual bedrock of Wong Kim Ark that it was resting on, which is the English common law.
That's right. And so, of course, the best way to read Wong Kim Ark is in the context of a unifying that includes all of the possible facts, which is the rule as it was described in Calvin's case in 1608
Mm-hmm.
specifically would apply in 1898, and it takes into account all of the facts, and the rule just operates correctly. That's all that's happened here.
Yep.
Like, this isn't complicated. And that's why I say, in order to come up with some sort of different reading of Wong Kim Ark, you would have to really want to get to a result that is not the natural reading of the case or the facts,
Yep.
and specifically not of the history, right? And so, anyway, you see the point, but that's you're not going to see a ton of references back to Luk Ting Sing, although that might occur, and you may not see very much in Lynch v. Clark. But you're going to hear the Supreme Court, no matter what its decision is, talk about its decision in my brain
Wong
just
Kim Ark.
broke inside
Don't
of
worry.
Wong Kim
Yeah.
Ark. Okay,
So,
so that's
and
good.
Lynch v. Clark, is that a New York
Yeah.
case?
I think it is. I didn't put the full citation in there, but I think it's a New York case,
it's a New York state case, and the point of that is not to suggest that like New York binds the rest of the country. The point of citing Lynch v. Clark is to establish that there were people at the time, jurists, who were looking around and acknowledging this is the rule, and so that's evidence of the rule's existence. Not that necessarily the decision of Lynch v. Clark is binding in the set of like binding precedent, but that it is informative of an unbroken streak of applying, the version of English common law rule. Again, with some hiccups in the case of like slaves, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, now we're getting into the meat and potatoes here. I probably have to go in about 15 minutes.
Oh, no worries, no worries.
So we're about to.
This has been great so far. So now we're getting into Trump versus Barbara. So the executive action by Trump establishes basically
Yep.
two classes of people to whom they deny birthright citizenship. If your father sorry, if your father is not a LPR or a citizen, and your mother is one of two things: a temporary person not here permanently, so a temporary visitor, a student, those kinds of things, or if they're here against the laws of the United States. In those two classes of individuals, what Trump's executive order does is say we are not going to recognize your citizenship, and that was immediately challenged. There was a decision relating to the scope of relief that some courts offered. This is the CASA decision, saying strike down universal injunctions, the interpretation of the Judiciary Act of 1789, and ultimately, though, it was quite simple to get a class action certified, and that multiple of them ended up at the Supreme Court. I think the Washington one is still, they haven't decided the cert petition there. But the first one that they took was the Barbara case, and that's what you're about to tell us about.
That's right. I just want to mention, because we started off our conversation talking about the Enlightenment and Enlightenment values, and that one of the values is that all people are born more or less equally, and inside of a state of nature, they are inherently sovereign and free. You will see that we have abandoned this language inside the executive order. So Section 1, purpose. The privilege of United States citizenship is a priceless and profound gift. Oh, so it's a
Privilege,
dispensation.
Yeah.
It's a dispensation from the sovereign. So I guess it's Trump is the one who gives all the gifts to all the people being born during his presidency. I actually think that is the mindset of the administration, by the
100%.
way. And I think that it is entirely anti-enlightenment. It runs contrary to all the things that our founding fathers believed in and thought about, and it runs against hundreds of years of British common law and value systems to say something like that. So even the diktat, that's not operative in the thing at all.
Right.
But you can just see already it's this psychotic notion that Trump is bestowing a gift upon us. What a great guy to be giving me the thing which I already had a right to anyway.
And it really is a rejection of the Enlightenment in the way you describe, because that is an old way of seeing is that law emanates from the king. And so, this whole, it's by the grace of the king, who by the grace of God bestows upon you this special privilege. That's a flipping of the philosophical bedrock here, but very much in line with their I don't know what to say, like their monarchical way of trying to govern.
That's right, and it's deeply un-American. It is a rejection not just of American tradition. It's a rejection of the English-speaking people's tradition, right? I mean, this goes back way before any of the colonies ever even happened. All right, the next slide is the District Court of New Hampshire is the one that originally saw this case. I'll just say, Pisco, I actually think there's been a bunch of nonsense on the procedure side of this. So the District Court of New Hampshire sits in the First Circuit. And as soon as this order comes down, so it says, quote, this is the second paragraph, petitioners will likely succeed in claiming the executive order violates the 14th Amendment and the INA. I'll also just mention that the INA has a specific provision saying birthright citizenship as well. This court finds, as it did in New Hampshire, Indonesian committee support, that the executive order likely, quote, contradicts the text of the 14th Amendment and the century-old untouched precedent that it interprets, close quote. Further, the executive order also likely violates Section 1401, which codified the pertinent language from the 14th Amendment. The three other district courts assessing the constitutionality of the executive order also found that plaintiffs would likely succeed, close quote. So that's just the easy and fast way for a court to say, we're going to do a TRO or a preliminary injunction as to this specific case, and then later on the class. The reason I say there's some shenanigans here, this gets appealed to the First Circuit, and then the court, the government, the DOJ
Directly
immediately asks it to hold an abeyance. And why would they do that, Pisco? It's because they know that every circuit is going to flip them off and say, this is ridiculous. There's no case or controversy here.
I do want to say that I'm glad that this happened as opposed to the world in which they just like don't appeal cases they lose to try to like game the system out. There was some feeling that might happen and after the universal injunction situation. Yeah, hopefully not. But
they're not that smart.
I want to make sure that no one lost what you said there, because it's really, really important that even if you were to concede the constitutional argument, which you in no sense should ever concede ever, but even if you were so ridiculous as to concede that argument, there's a separate law in the INA, which says essentially the same thing, establishes by constitutional statute the same exact rule, right? We have the Constitution part, we have the common law origin, and they put it in the Constitution, and they made a statute over it, and they passed that statute in like the 1940s and 50s, okay? And so even if you were to grant that they were wrong, Wong Kim Ark was wrongly decided, the people who passed the statute in 1940s and 50s, they thought what they were doing was incorporating Wong Kim Ark. So even if Wong Kim Ark was wrong, the purpose behind the legislators in the 1940s, 50s who established the statutory scheme, they were incorporating. Maybe it was a wrong interpretation. It wasn't, but that's what they were doing too. And so there's two arguments there. I hope the court will finally and concretely resolve the constitutional issue. I hope they won't just do the statutory one, but they could if they wanted to just address the statute without going into the Constitution. I know I'm taking up a lot of your time. I love the conversation.
No. I just canceled my lunch because I'm having too much fun. This is going well, so we're good.
Appreciate you.
So I also just want to mention in terms of shenanigans, holding it in abeyance was intentional. The other thing that could cause this thing to get weird is, and I don't know how class certifications work, but there's also quite a bit of conversation about if the district court properly named the class, and there's like a 5-factor test and like a ton of stuff going on there. I'm totally agnostic as to that. Not my area. I didn't go take the time. It probably would have taken 10 hours for me to figure out whether or not there's any sort of action there, but it's conceivable the Supreme Court could, as an extension of CASA, say, no, this isn't how we're supposed to do
for Rule 23 purposes and for class action stuff, which is, I think it's so ridiculous because this is like the classic case in which you would want like either an issue class or some sort of injunctive class that isn't deal with money damages. It's one legal issue. There's no like big factual thing. There's a question for you in the chat here, Nate, from a friend of the, consistent chatter, the common good. Quote, this conversation is so great. Is Nate a Lincoln Republican or a Galbraithian developmentalist leftist? I don't even know what that means, but
I don't know. I'm tabula rasa. You tell me. If I sound more one way or the other, then I guess that's what I am. I don't even know. I have no idea. I just know that I love America and I love the Enlightenment and I want to do those things. That's what I know.
Okay, so we have the decision from the District of New Hampshire. They go to appeal it and then say, hey, we actually don't want this intermediate appellate court decision. Let's just go straight to the Supreme Court. And frankly, this has been their posture for a lot of stuff, to try to just like not let the issue percolate in the intermediate courts. And the Supreme Court has been very inconsistent about whether or not it cares for legal issues to percolate in the appellate courts.
I will say this. We're gonna finish up here. There's only 2 slides left, chat, so don't worry. My little class is almost over. Thank you for putting up with all this. Now, I want to talk about, and I need your expertise and insight on this as to what the Supreme Court's likely to do, because I do not know. Now, the Ninth Circuit saw this case coming out of Washington. So this is the next slide. The Ninth Circuit brought up the case. The state of Washington sued. They tried to get standing. So same thing. There's a ton of weird standing issues and other stuff going on in that case. That case is not before the Supreme Court, but the Ninth Circuit says this, quote, the plain text and ordinary meaning of the 14th Amendment, controlling precedent, interpreting the Citizenship Clause, drafting history, and most post-ratification public understanding weigh in favor of plaintiffs' interpretation of the Citizenship Clause. For that reason, we conclude the plaintiffs are likely to succeed on the merits of their claim that the executive order violates the Citizenship Clause by denying citizenship to children who are born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, close quote. The only thing that's particularly interesting about the Ninth Circuit is they go through, I think very well, what are the rhetorical arguments from weird treatises in the 19th century that tries to create this confusion and this gin up this possible reading that people who are here temporarily or people who were here surreptitiously should not be getting their children granted citizenship. I think the Ninth Circuit does a good job at dispelling the record of those kinds of arguments. And I think it's just complete and total nonsense to even try to bring up this total weird dicta from the 19th century, which they have no instances that it ever controlled any. It was
the minority perspective. Yeah, it was the minority perspective for sure.
Not just the minority. We're talking about, it was like a weird minority perspective of European commentators and then it got imported back into American journals. Like, it's not even a real minority position.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because there's a point, and this is, I think, one of the most bad faith things that Ryan did in that debate. It was so pathetic to watch him do this, and at some point we should definitely watch it. But I bring up, I say the following: I'm like, you're not gonna find any definition of jurisdiction anywhere that is gonna say it's loyalty or political allegiance in the way that Ryan means. You can look at the history, you can look at Black's Law Dictionary, and you will not find a definition for subject to the jurisdiction thereof, which refers to like loyalty or anything like that. And Ryan and some of these Heritage Foundation people found that Black himself, right, had this view potentially. I haven't even looked into whether or not they're accurate about that. That Black himself, the dictionary writer, had this view about the 14th Amendment. And that's their big own. Their big own is, well, Black, you cited Black's Law Dictionary, and Black himself said the 14th Amendment means what we think it means. But of course, why is that bad faith? We don't cite a dictionary for what the dictionary author's personal views on a legal issue are. Okay? We don't look to the dictionary. Right. The dictionary writers aren't jurists necessarily. They're not binding on anybody. And at most, they're compiling sources to try to demonstrate the public meaning of a term. And what's helpful to understand the original public meaning is the dictionary, not the specific subjective views of the dictionary writer. It's like, we don't look to Merriam-Webster because we want to see what Merriam or Webster, I don't even know they're separate people. I think Webster, I think they are separate. Like, specific views on different issues are. We look to the dictionary to see what the public thought those words meant. And it's a similar thing here, where like they will pick and choose in the debates. They will pick and choose these different treatise writers, etc. But they're not looking at the overall big picture here. And they're trying to proclaim that it was so obvious that they're correct, even though they're a small minority in the sort of academy.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize too that, you know, that especially in the 19th century, we shouldn't be surprised that there were treatises that were more or less trying to get the prohibition on chattel slaves and their children to expand that rule to include other odious groups or something, right? Like, to say, like, I'm sure if we went to 1830 to South Carolina and asked a slaveholder, hey, do you think Mexicans born in the US should get citizenship? I'm sure he'd say no. I don't know why that's relevant.
Yeah.
The fact that there are people today who think that the 12th Amendment was a bad idea isn't relevant in my life. Like, I don't care about that. I just don't understand. But again, it's because the argument is so poor, it's so poorly reasoned, that they have to try to go find something to legitimize their poorly reasoned argument.
Yep.
And so they need to grasp onto and stretch beyond credulity a bunch of these ideas and a bunch of these old texts to try to get some legs for a bad argument.
100% agree.
Last thing, and then I just want to riff about where we're at, what we think is going to happen. The last thing, and I didn't put this in the slides, I hadn't quite figured it out yet, but on page 4 of the brief in support of the petition, so this is Trump's DOJ's brief, it says the following, quote, so again, their position is the rule was always meant to exclude these people since time immemorial. We've just been badly applying the law, okay? They can't actually find an instance where the law was applied in the way that they're saying, but that's beside the point. That's their position. So, quote, yet the executive branch, this is wild to me. This is why I say this is an attack on the Enlightenment. It's much deeper than just a policy issue. Quote, yet the executive branch has previously applied that misinterpretation to confer the privilege of American citizenship on hundreds of thousands of people who do not qualify for it. That misrepresentation has, in turn, powerfully incentivized illegal entry into the United States and encouraged, quote, this is them, scare quotes, birth tourists, close quote, to travel to the United States solely to acquire citizenship for their children. Recognizing the harmful consequences of extending, quote, the priceless and profound gift, close quote, of U.S. citizenship to countless individuals with no entitlement to it, President Trump on January 20th issued the executive order protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. The order advances broader efforts to combat these, quote, significant threats to national security and public safety, close quote, posed by illegal entry and birth tourism. Henceforth, consistent with the Citizenship Clause's original meaning, the executive branch would not treat future children of temporarily present aliens and illegal aliens as U.S. citizens. So again, I didn't hear any legal arguments there, Pisco. What I heard was an ugly attack on Enlightenment principles that Trump is the king, citizenship is derived at his pleasure, and it is not his pleasure to extend citizenship to babies because he has determined that they are not worth it, and that maybe one day they might be bad for him personally, I suppose, or the country writ large. And it's more than just a policy dispute. To me, this is an attack on the very concept that there is an American dream, that people are not judged based on the content of their character, but instead, not even just on the color of their skin, but who their dad was and who their mom was. And that is what makes them worthy, is something that a person has no control over. And to me, it is the seed of a total destruction of the social contract. And it is as bad as Dred Scott if the Supreme Court goes the wrong way on this. And I'm
Yeah.
deeply concerned.
Yeah,
I
this
am
would be,
deeply concerned about this.
to me, this would be on the level with Trump versus the United States, Dred Scott, Plessy v. Ferguson, all that stuff. It would be a total abandonment of lawmaking to accept these kind of policy arguments, these mean-spirited policy arguments, say that Trump is essentially, by his fiat, conferring this privilege, which he can withhold at his whim. And the key part about what you read is Trump has said this for future. But of course, that's just his whim as well, that it would apply only to the future.
That's just his whim.
And there's nothing stopping, if you accept Trump's rationale, only the executive order by its terms applies in the future. But what would stop them looking back? Right? Maybe there's some due process considerations or something, but like, who's to say?
Yeah, but
you could put into question the citizenship of all people who have been citizens, for years and years and years. And you want to think back to Nuremberg. We made the reference to Hitler. It's not inapt. What we would be doing is inviting the government to create these new codes by which they can re-examine the citizenship of people going back years and years and years. If you can find some place in the link in the past where this rule would not apply, maybe we can call into question the whole fucking thing. And the only reason that Trump isn't trying that yet is because he doesn't want to try it. So says the SG.
Yeah, I can't. It requires an arbitrary and capricious rulemaking process that's based upon favor with politicians as to whether or not you get citizenship or as to whether or not you keep your citizenship. That is their intellectual framework. And it has to be arbitrary and capricious. We could talk about all the details. Like, okay, hold on. So what if somebody is here on a visa, so they entered legally, and that's the mom. And then the dad is an illegal immigrant. But at the time of conception, she was still inside of, like, what does this attach to?
Yeah, when is it? Conception or birth?
Like, is it conception or birth? Is it 5 minutes after birth? Is it like what? I mean, you have to draw arbitrary, intellectually corrupt lines to make the rule work. Unless, of course, the rule is actually at the pleasure of Trump. And if that's what the real rule is, then there's no rule of law. We have abandoned the concept that individuals have inherent dignity and worth. And instead, we've said worth is dispensed by our betters. It's the least American thing I could ever think of. It is way worse. In my opinion, this stuff is on par with the founding of the Confederacy. And like some of the weird psychotic stuff they put into their founding documents, that's this kind of stuff. It's a throwback to like some weird Roman sycophantic, the great generals of the past are the ones who bestow favor upon people. And I'm telling you right now, Rome fell because it sucked. It was awful. Like, I don't look to Rome for moral or government insight. They're a part of my history. I guess you can sort of link up some of the concepts inside of the Enlightenment back to Rome,
Some cool
whatever.
statues.
But the truth is that Rome fell because it was a decayed, stupid human project that was corrupt to its core. And of course, corrupt systems eventually fall. It may take some generations, but these types of systems that are arbitrary, capricious, and are corruption is the rule, you end up miserable. The people end up miserable. The leaders end up miserable. Everyone ends up miserable. It is a self-defeating, idiotic way to live. And I don't want this for me and my country or my children or anybody else's children. It is crazy to me
Yeah.
that this is the hill people want to die on. We
And
can
you're
talk about illegal
yeah.
immigrants and what we should do with them. We can talk about what are legitimate levels of immigration. We can talk about civic engagement. We can talk about assimilation. All of those things are in bounds. I'm going to disagree. They're in bounds. This should be out of bounds. It's nuts to me. But I just don't think people have thought about it. I think that they're instinctive. I don't even know if the Trump people realize what they're doing.
Yeah,
I
no,
really don't. I have no idea.
I totally agree with everything you just said there, and it's not just a discrete legal issue, like you say. It is a civilizational. It is a broader issue, and the proof of that isn't just in everything we've talked about in the poor nature of the legal argument. It's also in other things they're proposing, such as denaturalization. So, for example, you have people from the administration saying, or people who are aligned with the administration saying, we should denaturalize Mehdi Hassan. We should denaturalize Hassan Piker. We should denaturalize Cenk Uygur. There was Katie Miller, who is the wife of this odious figure, Stephen Miller, who really has a great deal of influence in this country and is deciding domestic policy when, especially on immigration. They were in the middle of a debate on like Israel or something, or some other some bullshit about Trump, a political debate which is protected. And in the course of that debate, Katie Miller says, "We might have to check on your citizenship naturalization paper." Thank you, Gert. And that is what is being proposed here is, if you think out of step with us, if you're not allied with the king, if you're not loyal to the king, you're not even a citizen. We'll look into you. And so it is a deeper, it's not just discrete in this birthright citizenship context. It has to do with their overall outlook and rejection of Enlightenment and small L liberal values.
And I just want to be clear too. I'm not predicting. I don't know what's going to happen with the Supreme Court. Gun to my head, I think it's an 8-1 decision. I think that the only person who goes along with the government on this is Alito. I think everybody else sits, including Clarence Thomas. I think that he's going to sit on this one. Privileges and immunities reasons, like weird stuff that we haven't talked about now. Stuff. I think, yeah, there's other weird reasons, but I think it'll be an 8-1. That's just my take. I have no reason to believe this. I don't know. I've actually met Clarence Thomas. I actually took a class from him for a week.
People say he's really
Creighton.
nice.
He comes to Creighton. His wife is a Creighton grad. Yeah. So he and I chatted on a number of topics. Me and this other guy, Mitch, we asked him once, we said, so do you believe in stare decisis at all? Like point blank, do you believe in stare decisis at all? And he says, the only stare decisis I need is the Constitution. All right. I guess that answers that. He doesn't believe
he doesn't really believe in it at all. I had my con law professor was a Supreme Court clerk, and he said the overwhelming sentiment among the clerks is that the nicest justice was Clarence Thomas. And this was
he's a great guy.
And that's why it's so important, folks, for us to separate like interpersonal from their ideas and stuff. You can be very nice and I think have a bad legal philosophy. In terms of the prediction, I do think more likely than not they will overturn this executive order. That said, I go so far as to say like 69%, and that's it, because there's always some bullshit. Yeah. I thought the legal arguments for presidential immunity were among the weakest I have ever seen. And notwithstanding that, they held it up. The same thing with the Anderson decision. I thought this argument that the states couldn't enforce Section 3 to be so horrible. The fact that it was a 9-0 decision to me is like insane. So I just have no confidence that this court is principally rooted. I mean, think about another case that we haven't talked about, Humphrey's executor, which they're almost certainly going to overturn, like 99.99%. That's a case having to do with protections from removal by the president. I bet you that what they're about to do right now is to create a sui generis rule for the Federal Reserve that's based on nothing. That we can protect the chair of the Federal Reserve or the board of governors on the Federal Reserve, but not other agencies just cause. And when you have a court that is making rulings just cause, yeah, the predictability of it is like just it's not there anymore. So I think the argument
Yeah.
against birthright citizenship is some of the weakest legal reasoning that I have ever seen. But I can only go so far as to say I think it's like 69, 70%. I don't think it's going to be unanimous. I think it's likely to be 7-2. But again, it's not. I said this before Trump was inaugurated. I made a Twitter video that you have to have belief in the Supreme Court, and crucially, I have very little.
Well, this is okay. So let's tease this out. I want to tease this out. So this is just thought experiment. I have no idea.
Okay, should I
So
close the
to me,
PowerPoint?
yeah, of course. Oh yeah, yeah. Get
Okay.
rid of that. We're done. So you can, if anybody's interested, the briefs on that are wild. People who are supporting this stuff. It's a ton of talk. We talked at the very beginning. It seems like a long time ago now. There are these like different categories of immigration concerns. People who are deeply xenophobic do not want a diverse country, meaning that they want a predominantly white, sort of ethnocentric kind of country. They like to collapse these categories. You see that in all of the writing, in all of the amicus briefs.
Yeah.
So these briefs talk about the dangers and difficulty of illegal immigration and how there's, and I don't think it's been well reasoned, by the way, that there's an obvious link between birthright citizenship and the motivation for people to illegally come to the US. I have lots of clients who are illegally present in the US and they do not have children. What are you talking about? This is crazy. But they make that link and then they say it's such a vital import that we stop this immigration problem that we should really just ignore everything else. And that is very much what the underlying policy objective is to just make immigration impossible into the US.
Yeah, no,
And
and
I just
can we
think
just pause
that
right there because
that's
there's something really important there on the incentive structure for the immigrants. There are usually unlimited visas for close familial relationships. If you want to try to get a green card based on someone who's part of your immediate family, there's unlimited visas available there. However, in the context of children, you don't get that benefit until I think they turn 18. I think that's right, and or 21 or something.
21.
21, yeah. And
21.
and so you'd have to wait 21 years. They would have to not themselves be married or something else. There's like additional rules there when it comes to reunification. And so the only advantage that it would offer you is in some of these discretionary forms of defensive relief at times. They consider the fact, your ties to U.S. citizens, and obviously if you have U.S. citizen children. But like that's a lot of like thinking in the future about, what if I'm in an adversarial proceeding? What if I want to get this like sort of special discretionary relief that is very seldom given, and they would consider as part of the totality of circumstances the relationship with the child. It just isn't a good, because your child is a citizen, it doesn't make you a citizen, and that's why we separate those two things. And if anything, it can cause problems. And so I just don't think that that's a really good incentives argument. You have to wait till they're 21. You're going to wait 21 years? Is that how we're planning ahead? That I do this so that in 21 years
Yeah.
I can become a citizen?
So I think too, again, I think that there are valid arguments to be had about levels of immigration. What should we do with the people who are here? What should we do for border security? Why is it that we've had such a huge number of people go around legal paths to come into the United States? All of that's on the table. I don't want our conversation today to make it sound like if you're for birthright citizenship, you are therefore for open borders. That's not
Yeah, no.
true. That is not true. You can be hyper restrictive and leave birthright citizenship alone. And my point with all of this is there is a larger project, a larger intellectual project that this is a piece of, which to me, this is a key piece that will start a domino and chain of events that could be as bad as the Dred Scott stuff, right? It really could be that bad. It won't be that bad the day after. We're probably going to get this one on like June 30th. Last one. The court will wait till the end. Somebody might leak it. But, I don't know what's going to happen. It could be all sorts of stupid. I have no clue. But I will just say that if there were to be some sort of true constitutional crisis, this will be a direct and proximate cause to that true constitutional crisis where there could be blood in the streets. I really think that this is that big of a deal. There have been murders by ICE and CBP just this year, not just two citizens in Minneapolis. There have been people who've been killed in detention facilities, right? And that stuff worries me, but it does not worry me to the same extent as this intellectual domino falling. This is an attack on the underpinnings of all of our society. And if you attack that, I am deeply saddened by the people who've lost their lives, but we can overcome and get beyond that as a people. If this stuff starts to fall, I don't know how you come
Yeah.
back without just saying new social contract, and that's a lot of
Or new
misery.
or new
That's an
civil war.
enormous amount of misery.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I don't think he's being alarmist, guys. I just take the following situation, which is not outside the realm of possibility. Let's say the Supreme Court says Trump is correct. Allegiance means loyalty, and or allegiance means lawful domicile. That's what it means. And let's say they rule on the merits in favor of Trump in this case, which is possible. No one is 100% confident that Trump is going to lose this, but let's say they rule on the merits. Tomorrow, do we think it's outside the realm of possibility that Trump would issue an order that says, in my discretion, putting aside my executive order of January 20th, for individuals who I deem to be a threat to the national interest of the United States, we will, on a case-by-case basis, not recognize their citizenship, provided that their citizenship is not established by the Constitution or the recent decision of Barbara, which found that loyalty from the parents is a prerequisite to jurisdiction, which is a prerequisite to birthright citizenship. In that context, Trump issues that order and says, we're going to look into all of our enemies. And if we find in these enemies some place where we can claim no loyalty or no lawful domicile as a prerequisite to a jurisdictionhood, we're going to start rounding up people who claim they're citizens, but they're not actually citizens. They're not actually citizens because their parents aren't citizens. Their parents aren't citizens because their parents weren't loyal to the United States or weren't lawfully domiciled. And now we're arresting citizens and proposing to deport them who are politically against the president. That's all it takes. And it's not beyond Trump to do that. If he gets a rule from SCOTUS suggesting one of these tests, they will start looking into, in the back, the citizenship priors of people they don't like.
Um, I there's a lot I could do out in speculation land. I think that's all very reasonable. I want to ask an interesting question. Ethnocentrism. So, and is there? I can't think of it, but is there a way that we could, while applying Enlightenment values, make an argument that having an ethno state is in harmony with Enlightenment values? I don't think so. Can you think of a way to steelman that? Because I do think that there's a non-trivial number of people, especially white men on the internet, who are deeply concerned about demographic shifts. They're deeply concerned about the character of their country from an ethnic perspective. I think that is a real anxiety for a bunch of people. I don't share that anxiety, but I believe it's a real phenomena that's happening. And is there any way that inside of an Enlightenment context you could justify this kind of thing? I don't think we can, but I'd be
Well,
interested in your take on that.
yeah, so not as we define Enlightenment values, but of course, we're not the ones who would define Enlightenment values in that context for themselves, right? Just as we alluded to, or I alluded to with, our stream that we're eventually going to do on Nazi law and legal developments in Nazi Germany, right? It's not like they didn't have a conception of property in Nazi Germany. Not like they didn't have a conception of rule of law in Germany, in Nazi Germany. They did. It just had a denominator, and that denominator did not include enemies of the state, and that denominator did not include certain unspeakables and unmentionables. And so, how do I imagine the argument going? Well, they're going to redefine Enlightenment values. Enlightenment values are white man's rules. Those are the rules for white people, and they were made by white people, by European Anglos, and that's to whom it applies. And these other people, they don't share our values, and they're not subject to our application of our rules for white people. We don't have to do that. We have to give those rules and those protections for the people who are like us, and they're not like us, and it was never intended for them to be part of us. And that's why Enlightenment and ethnocentrism are consistent, because they'll just define Enlightenment so as to be exclusive to their people.
So yeah, I think then you would have to take um, an ethnic value and attach it at the moment of birth and say that in a state of nature that white people are superior in that state and therefore play by the Enlightenment set of rules, and that non-whites, and maybe there's a spectrum, I don't know, people get dumb and arbitrary and weird on this stuff. Maybe there's a spectrum of the browns where the Hispanic person is tier 2 and the dark African is tier
You
7 or
laugh,
something, and the Jews are
you
in there.
laugh, but I have to push you here. It's not like this is new. The American Indians'
Right.
property rights were not respected.
Yeah.
I mean, we have this case McIntosh, where that I think the case is called McIntosh, that property
Yeah.
rights that everyone talks about. Same thing with members of quote unquote the slave race. And so, unfortunately, this whole like rules for thee and not for rules for me and not for thee, in the sense of rules being good, that is not something without precedent. And the colonists themselves recognize that American Indians had some sort of like right to occupy, right to reside, but they didn't really have the same kind of property rights as white Europeans. This was terra nullius, okay? And they didn't get to claim
Yeah.
dominion at all. And so that I don't think that is. I think we've interpreted enlightenment
Well,
to
but
be equality, but it's not a necessary implication.
yeah, that's right. I mean, as a practical point, you're right. I just mean, in order for an ethno state to really exist, you have to draw what I think is an arbitrary line somewhere. So, like I said, Hitler was trying to figure out how to codify and industrialize this process. Okay, and he and his best thinking people were unable to find a
Yeah,
rule or criteria that could hold. That's why I say, like, it is true to say that in the historical record, Enlightenment values pop into existence as an evolutionary process. Let's give it the 17th century.
sure.
But since that time, there have been lots of violations of people who purported to have Enlightenment values. And I think that that's just true. But the values and the ideas that are at the foundation of the Enlightenment that have to do with a baby is equal to every other baby, right? Like even height and weight and stuff, it's so different. Like as adults, we start to get huge differences as a practical matter. You and I are not the same height and weight and. But like as from a child's perspective, as from an infant's perspective, the equality is like very obvious. And you just go, well, we will operate in a world from that obvious observation. It's obvious because it's observable by everybody that these babies are not different. And then you say, okay, I'm going to make an arbitrary and capricious difference. And to me, it's just hard. I think you
But they
have
don't
to then
start with
start
that though,
appealing
right?
to.
Yeah, they have this race
Well,
essentialist
sure. Yeah, that's
view.
well, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you're right. So then instead you start off with some other sort of starting place. Because if you start at that place, if you start the story at the moment of infancy, then yeah, all this stuff makes perfect sense. But if you start at someplace else, like, well, I'm going to start at my quintuple great grandpa. That's where I'm going to start it, right? Or something like some heritage American kind of an argument. Then it's like, well, okay, but it's just arbitrary. It just gets back to you have to just do an arbitrary line. And I don't think that it's defensible with observation and evidence to say that that arbitrary line really makes sense. And then it creates, I think all ethnostates are inherently a ticking time bomb. I think every ethnostate is a ticking time bomb for the same reason. And I don't know. It's just strange to me. I don't know how you could look back to like the 1600s, the prior to the 1600s, and go, that was it. That was the golden age. We just got to get back to the medieval period. Like that's it. That's where all the good stuff was happening. It's crazy to me. I don't get it. I don't get it.
Have you seen the Spielberg movie Lincoln? I bet you have.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to
Yeah.
quote from it. This is Lincoln talking. You're an engineer. You must know Euclid's axioms and common notions. The engineer responds, I must have in school, but Lincoln says, I never had much of a schooling, but I read Euclid in an old book I borrowed. Little enough ever found its way in here, but once learned, it stayed learned. Euclid's first common notion is this: things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. That's a rule of mathematical reasoning. It's true because it works, has done, and always will do. In his book, Euclid says this is self-evident. You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law, it's a self-evident truth that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. We begin with equality, that's the origin, isn't it? That's balance, that's fairness, that's justice. In other words, what does it mean to say something is self-evident? To say something is self-evident is to say it is an assumption. It is an unjustified belief. An assumption is something that isn't proven. It's something, it's axiomatic before justification.
Right.
It's something on which
A
justification is
brute fact
premised.
sometimes. Yeah.
A brute fact. And for those who don't share in that self-evident truth, you will not be able to convince them. And they will find a way to try to justify their race science, because they don't hold that assumption. And unfortunately, when we get there, when we get to the bedrock, when we meet the Joel Weapons of the world, I don't think you can appeal to them with rational thought and logic. I think the only way to appeal to them is to their better angels, emotion, and appeals to character and things that are more intuitive and human than proving it.
When I was 12 years old, I fell in love with America, and like the I really like that quote. I think that Steven Spielberg does a great job. By the way, the fact that a Jewish American would be the person to highlight that and
Yep.
to help write those words, I think is like really impressive. Like I think it's really impressive. The moment that I sort of fell in love with the piece of media that caused me to fall in love with America was TNT back in like the 90s had what's it called? Angel? No, the Gettysburg movie. It was like a
Mm.
made for TV movie. I can't remember. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's but it does. It's got one of the main characters I think is Jeff Daniels, and he's Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He's like super young, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this big moment on the Battle of Little Round Top, and so there's this. It's a true story. I don't know if obviously the dialogue is not true, but there's this regiment from Maine. None of them are professional soldiers, and they're going to hold Little Round Top, and they're going to turn the tide of the war for Gettysburg. At this exact moment, they win the battle because of the stand, and Colonel Chamberlain gives this little speech to his men. He says,
Mm-hmm.
"We are an army out to set other men free. America should be free ground, all of it, not divided by a line between slave states and free, all the way from here to the Pacific Ocean. No man has to bow. No man born to royalty. Here we judge you by what you do, not by who your father was. Here you can be something. Here is the place to build a home. And it's not the land. There's always more land. It's the idea that we all have value, you and me. What we are fighting for in the end, we're fighting for each other." Like, how have we missed this? Where did that go? Like, where's that gone? I don't get it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And it does feel though that every new generation needs to rediscover equality before under the law, equality of human experience, and just as Lincoln redefined what it is, Jefferson's words that all men are created equal. He really was. I mean, this was a sleight of hand in a sense. Yes, he's riffing on an idea that Jefferson had, but not at the level that Lincoln was expounding it, and in so doing claimed ownership of the entire history of the United States. What does he say in the start of the Gettysburg Address? 407 years ago, our fathers brought upon this continent, a new nation, clothed in liberty
Conceived in liberty.
conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition all men are created equal. So he is specifically reaching in to the Declaration of Independence, for which to justify his notion, which wasn't part of the framing generation, that men are equal, right? And that we are all equal. And of course, the word there is men. And in further generations, we have to, again, redefine, reassert what it means to be equal with respect to women. And so I just think that this is it's not set in stone that society will always progress and move forward as we understand it. And sometimes there are setbacks. And if this were to rule another way, it would be a setback. It would be us fighting a battle we've already fought. The Civil War was about defining the scope of citizenship as a baseline matter. And it is very, very sad to me that we would, instead of looking to our fathers for guidance, for inspiration, and to be better than them, that we're repeating the same battles that they bled and died for in these places that you just noted.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that some lessons can't be intellectually transmitted. They have to just be experienced. And so if we have to experience a bunch of stupid and a bunch of unnecessary pain so that we can stop harming ourselves in the future, then I suppose that's just where we are. Maybe there's just no other way around it.
Yeah, no, I happen to agree with that. And the sad part, I had this view, and I want to get your take on it a little bit, and you will let me know when you really, really, really have to go. I just been loving the conversation.
Yeah.
I had a disappointment at the 2024 election. Obviously, I really thought that Trump should lose that election, and I got blackpilled for it. I'm like, American people, they don't really care about these values anymore. If they're going to elect this man again, we have lost our way. We don't really care about values, but I do think they care, but I think they care about it at a different level, and it's disappointing, but I think it's something. It's a bit of a white pill that they care a lot about these values from a ritualistic sense, from a physiological sense, and from a community sense. And this is what I mean. They're not committed to democracy in the ideal of democracy. They're committed to democracy because they like to vote, because it's fun to vote, because they've always voted, because Americans vote. That's just what Americans do. They go to their local place and they vote. And then you know what happens? They talk about it and they watch the news. And it's fun. Even the Trump stooges, right? Many of whom are trying to undo elections and democratic processes. You watch their stooges on the news and they have these election day watch parties because that's just what Americans do. They like to do it. There's a reflexiveness about the practice of democracy. And in the context of what's going on with ICE, etc., is it because ideologically Americans are not committed to mass deportations? No. If you ask them the question, are you committed to mass deportation in the way that you phrased at the start of the conversation, they'll say, ideologically want to deport every single illegal immigrant. But what gets their jimmies rustled? When, oh, you're getting abuela who makes the pupusas down the street. Oh, you're fucking with my job, right? Oh, you're, these are our friends. It's about bonds of friendship. It's about bonds of community. And when you do that, then the commitment comes through. But it's not on the ideological ground. I think it has more to do with, like, you're attacking us, you're coming into our place, this is where we are a community, and you're sort of trespassing in a way. And that's the level that a lot of these, I think, Americans care about these various different issues. And it's not premised on the English common law from an ideological perspective. It's premised on what those things.
Yeah, you and I are
achieved.
weirdos.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, we're the weirdos, right? I mean, we are not your typical person. We've been to law school. We suffered through late nights at the library, agonizing over dumb stuff like this. But I do want to say that I think that there is a real wound. I don't know if that's the right word, but there's a real wound in the hearts of a lot of Americans right now who are wanting and are instinctively moving towards this type of thinking. I mean, this anti-enlightenment thinking I'm talking about.
Oh yeah, sure.
And it's valid. Like, this is not a moral failing, although I do think that it manifests as moral failings. Okay, I want to be clear. I think there are moral failings, but I think that the underlying feeling that somehow the country has left them behind, that the character of the country isn't something that they recognize or they feel included in or a part of, I think that's real. I mean, I do think that's real. I just wish that the instinct wasn't to reach for tools that I think are so harmful. That would be my hope. And I do think that the country needs to do a better job. And I think this is why I'm not a leftist and I'm not part of the Democratic Party. I'm a registered independent, I'll have you know. But the reason I don't associate with that is I don't think that Democrats have provided a very good story or mythos to help explain what we should be proud of as Americans. I think that there's been a lot of cynicism based in reality. Again, I think that there's a wound sitting in the hearts of generationally disenfranchised Black people in this country. And I think that's valid. And I think that those wounds, however, people have reached for tools that are not ultimately going to fix that or help that wound heal. And so I just hope that at some point, somebody somewhere is able to stand up and have a vision for the future that is a little more universal and isn't so tribal. These propositions by the Trump administration are a siloed tribal tool and solution. It will not work for tens of millions of Americans. It is self-harming. I have to admit that the left, I believe, has come up with some of these not similar, they're not similar, but they've come up with other things that I think have siloed us as well, and hasn't been very universal in its approach to trying to make all ships rise, especially on the cultural front. I think that it's been fast change, and I think people have been left behind, and I don't think those people should be lectured to. I think that's a mistake. And so,
Strategically,
those are just wounds. How are they going to heal?
Yeah, it's not going to be me who's going to be able to.
I don't know how those
do
wounds heal.
Yeah, I people like me can't heal the wounds because I'm too haughty. I talk down sometimes, and I ridicule, and I my attempt is sometimes to truth tell And so I don't know that I'm the best person to communicate that message. Whoever is going to do it, it's on a different level. And yeah, I understand. We've seen The Dark Knight where Michael Caine, Alfred says, they in their whatever they turn to a man they didn't quite understand, and I think that that's kind of
Yeah,
describes a
yeah,
little bit of what's going on. I mean, these solutions
I agree
aren't
with that. Yeah,
solutions at all. I mean, it's madness in a way, and they don't truly understand. And you can tell by the polling of it that what used to be Trump's issue, I think he might still be above water or approaching above water on specifically the border. Like there, it's like it's always up and down, but like on
yeah,
immigration is way down. Um, and it's because I think that it's more about the sentiment and what it feels like. And it feels like Trump represents renewal. Trump represents strength. Trump
yeah.
represents some concrete identity. Now I think it's all lies, pack of lies, but there needs to be an alternative, and that can't be intellectualism. That can't be technocratic, talking down to people. And so the people like me aren't going to provide that solution. It's going to be someone who speaks to the people, the disaffected, in a more emotionally resonant way that makes them feel connected, like Trump does when you look
Yeah.
at those MAGA rallies.
And I think that it's been undervalued because obviously I dislike the president. I don't know if that's a surprise as we've gone through this exercise today. I do not like the president. At the same time, I cannot deny most of my family on my wife's side, they're not just Trumpers. They stand in line for 5 hours to
Mm,
get into a stadium where they'll sit for 2 hours before Trump comes. And you know what they have is they have the feeling of a new community. And that's what they have. I mean, they are flocking to a community, and it's real, and it has been good for them, and it's helped give meaning to some of these people's lives. And I will not deny that. I, like you, think that we've turned to a guy who isn't particularly principled. He kind of has a mafioso approach to life. I think all of his life, not just his governance, but all of his life, is sort of a mob boss mentality. I think I really enjoyed the TV show Andor. I'm sure you liked
I
that. I
really
don't know
liked
if you
it.
saw that.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah,
Yeah, the showrunner for that, what's his name? Tony. Can't remember his last name. Anyway, the showrunner for that, he's done a few interviews, and one of the things that he has said is that um, that one of the things that he's worried about is as we live life, just as the people inside of his fictional universe lived life, that the destruction of community, order feels like community. That having like a clean street, having a clean street could mean that you have a really strong community. It could also mean everybody's terrified and not going outside, right? Like there's sort of this you reach for a tool to solve a problem, and it does technically solve the problem, but it creates these underlying other issues. Gilroy is his name, Tony Gilroy, and I think that Tony's onto something with that. That there's just this rot inside of our communities that sometimes we reach out for solving the downstream consequences of our broken communities instead of trying to heal the centerpiece. And the centerpiece does, I don't know, this is why, folks on the left, how can we be honest about our past as Americans, but still love our past as Americans,
yeah.
right? Like
It's
that's a
Biden's
tough dance.
yeah, it's Biden's greatest failure is to resolve those contradictions and to heal the soul of the nation. I think that you may not agree, but I think that Biden was the best president in my lifetime. Of course, I'm pretty left, but in general, I thought that he was an honorable person. But he failed in restoring the soul of
No, I
America.
think that's true.
And
Yeah, I voted
interesting.
for him.
Eh,
I didn't,
Base, the last movie reference I want to do, since you had the Andor thing, is The Godfather. How does it start? It
yeah.
starts with this funeral
Okay.
home guy. Bonacera says, I believe in America. America has made my fortune, and I raised my daughter in the American fashion. I gave her freedom, but I taught her never to dishonor her family. He found a boyfriend, not an Italian. We went to the movies with him. She stayed out late. I didn't protest. 2 months ago, he took her for a drive with another boyfriend. They made her drink whiskey, and they tried to take advantage of her. She resisted. She kept her honor, so they
Mm,
beat her like an animal. When I went to the hospital, her nose was broken, her jaw was shattered, held together by wire. She couldn't even weep because of the pain. But I wept. Why did I weep? She was the light of my life, beautiful girl. Now she will never be beautiful again. I went to the police like a good American. These two boys were brought to trial. The judge sentenced them to 3 years in prison and suspended the sentence. suspended the sentence. They went free that day. I stood in courtroom like a fool. And those two bastards, they smiled at me. Then I said to my wife, for justice, we must go to Don Corleone. I don't deny that many American people who have fallen to Trump and MAGA have that feeling that the American system that they were promised hasn't worked for them. It hasn't worked for them economically. It hasn't worked for them in terms of justice. There are free riders. They see it everywhere, and it makes them mad. And so they go to a different Donald Trump. Yeah, but obviously the consequences of those are legion. And the less said about that, better. That the cycle of anger and revenge and violence doesn't end, and there needs to be a better solution to resolve those true grievances and those true feelings.
Yeah, and I've taught a little immigration class a few times at Creighton Law, and I will often use that opening speech. And then I also used when Vito Corleone, when in The Godfather Part 2, when he enters Ellis Island, I use that to break down how much of that same system is still alive today.
Yeah.
How the old man who got his name wrong is the immigration judge, that the person sitting next to him is a USCIS officer, that there's still a medical exam, like all that stuff is still present. But it is such a beautiful illustration about how the American experience for all of us is one of an immigrant, and that includes the native peoples, because the country changed under their feet. They, without really consenting to it, became part of a country. They were forced to migrate. Black Americans were forced to migrate. We are all immigrants into this current moment. And I think that the immigrant experience is the best way to understand America. And so the most powerful stories in art, I think, are immigrant stories. And I just want to echo that. I think that's a great place to go and maybe a good place to end.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Nate, thank you so much for coming through. It was a really awesome discussion. I mean, usually the nature of the conversation I have is a little bit more like, I don't know, aggressive and acrimonious, because I'm oftentimes having like people who like don't agree with me on. But it's nice once in a while to have a really awesome conversation. And I felt that despite political differences, we're aligned on the foundations there. And with uncertainty in the
Yeah.
future, I think we know where we want to get to. Why don't you tell the audience where to find your Twitter, where you can get a lot of retweets of base things and polls and stuff, and sometimes legal takes on immigration. Where can they find you, and do you have any closing thoughts for the audience?
Yeah, just at Nathan Dallon, NathanDallon. That's my real name. That's my real Twitter handle. Um, do not call me for immigration advice. I'm real busy. If you do not live in Omaha, I'm probably not going to take your case. So I just say this is not a solicitation for
Oh,
services.
yeah, no,
um,
no, yeah. So no one call him for immigration help, and no one call me either. Okay, no one call me either. Last thing, do you think that Nebraska's in play, the Senate?
oh, of course. Yeah, the answer to that's yes. The answer to that is
Interesting.
yes. The state of Nebraska, there's a bunch of undercurrents. We've kind of been purpley, especially in the metro areas
Yes.
anyway, but the answer is yes. We do not have a particularly strong bench for the GOP right now. Western Nebraska is as Trump a place as there is in the country. I think during 2016, I don't remember in 2024, but in 2016, 89% of all voters in Western Nebraska voted Trump, and only 5% voted Hillary Clinton,
Wow.
which meant there were 6% that were voting for like the constitutional candidate and like
Yep.
some even more extreme stuff. And so but the metro areas are upset. They are not happy. Don Bacon, who's our representative in Omaha, he's as close to the thing to a moderate
Be
as you can
moderate.
have. He
Yeah.
still votes basically
Yeah. Yeah.
constantly GOP. But nonetheless, his vibe is not that of a bootlicker. And so and he's out, he's retiring, and so I think that's in play, and I do think that the Senate could be in play. Pete Ricketts has got problems, so we'll see. I don't know. Time will tell.
No, I appreciate that insight, and hopefully we can chat again at some point. But thank you so much, Nate. Wonderful conversation. Everyone follow
I
him. Go
would say
for it.
if we're gonna chat again, we should chat. Let's put two things on the calendar.
Sure.
April 2nd is after the oral arguments.
Oh, a reaction.
Yeah, so we could do a quick reaction to what happens in oral arguments, and then of course the decision itself will drop at the end of June. So maybe a little
Yeah.
like 4th of July
I
ish
I'm so down for that.
thing.
That would be wonderful. Let's stay in touch, and we'll definitely do those. And yeah, thank you so much for coming through, and really appreciate your insights.
Well, I appreciate that you were willing, as soon as I reached out, to quickly put this together. So I hope chat enjoyed.
Oh, they
I'm
loved it.
probably not the
No,
usual on here,
no,
but
they really really enjoyed it, and nothing but positive stuff. So really appreciate you. And in fact, a lot of people actually um they appreciate your style, because I've done the debate on this issue with Ryan before. Like I said, in the World War debate context, and a lot of people in the chat actually prefer the way that you said it than how I said it. And so really really great, and they overwhelmingly positive
well,
sentiment.
if you thought it would be interesting, I would be willing to talk to one of the psychopaths on the right about this. I would love to get. Let's have a little feeling
Yes,
session.
no, wait, no.
Where is this coming from?
Yeah, yeah. No, I know people, lawyers who believe this nonsense, and listen, they never want to give me any kudos because, like, I am this Hispanic-looking guy, and I'm like an asshole on Twitter, and so you're much more their tribe. You're like this clean-cut Mormon guy. You don't drink coffee. You know, so you're much more in their wheelhouse to
Right.
to give credit to, and so maybe it would be useful, and so to the extent that
I don't
people
know.
talk about that, I'll bring you up and see if they want to debate you or talk to you at least and have a conversation.
All right.
All right.
Yeah,
Hey,
you'll have to. I have no platform, so you'll have to. Like,
I'll
I'm not coming
facilitate it.
unless you're coming. So that's
I'll facilitate, and
all right.
thank you so much, Nate, and we'll talk soon. Okay.
All right. Appreciate you guys. Thanks.
Peace
Bye
out.
bye.
What a awesome combo, guys.